Chapter 1. Symbolism and Allegories of the Devachanic World. In an incipient epistle authored by a distinguished occultist, the ensuing passage was presented as a citation reconstructed from memory. I have remained unable to definitively ascertain its primary origin, although a text that appears to constitute an alternate, significantly amplified iteration is discernible within Biel's catena of Buddhist scriptures. Our Lord Buddha proclaims that, situated many thousand myriads of world systems beyond our present sphere, there resides a domain of beatitude, designated as Sukhavati. This region is encompassed by 7 tiers of railings, 7 tiers of colossal draperies, and 7 rows of undulating trees. This hallowed abode of the Arhats is administered by the Tathagatas and populated by the Bodhisattvas. It encompasses 7 precious lakes, within the center of which circulate crystalline waters endowed with 7 discrete attributes and characteristics, yet coalesced into a unified whole. This, O Shariputra, constitutes the Devachan. Its celestial Udambara flower extends a root into the umbra of every terrestrial sphere and effloresces for all who achieve access to it. Those who find nativity within this sanctified realm, having traversed the auriferous bridge and attained the 7 golden mountains, are indeed supremely favored. For, within that cycle, neither tribulation nor melancholy remains their portion. Although shrouded in the resplendent allegories of the Orient, one may perceive within this excerpt the principal characteristics most lucidly delineated by our contemporary investigators. The 7 golden mountains typify the 7 subdivisions of the mental plane, demarcated from one another by impediments that are impalpable yet genuine and efficacious, precisely as 7 rows of railings, 7 rows of immense curtains, or 7 rows of undulating trees might appear upon the earth. The 7 varieties of crystalline water, each possessing its unique properties and attributes, symbolize the manifold powers and mental states inherent to them, whilst the singular quality universal to all guarantees, for those who reside therein, the supreme intensity of beatitude of which they are susceptible. Its flower does, in truth, embed a root within the shadow of every earth, for from every world man enters his corresponding celestial sphere, and the felicity that no rhetoric can adequately articulate is the blossom that emerges for all who conduct their lives in a manner rendering them worthy of its attainment. They have traversed the golden bridge spanning the current that divides this realm from the world of desire. For them, the conflict between the superior and the inferior has concluded, and for them, there exists no further grief or sorrow in that cycle until man transitions once more into incarnation and the celestial domain is again relinquished for a season. Chapter 2. The transcendent essence of spiritual ecstasy. This profundity of bliss constitutes the primary tenet which must serve as the foundation for all our conceptualizations of the celestial existence. It is not solely that we are concerned with a domain in which, by its intrinsic nature, malevolence and sorrow are precluded from existence, nor merely a world wherein every entity possesses happiness, but rather a sphere where the reality transcends even these verities. It is a realm in which every soul, by the very virtue of its presence there, partakes of the consummate spiritual ecstasy it is capable of experiencing, a realm whose response to aspiration is circumscribed only by the soul's own capacity to aspire. Here, for the inaugural moment, we commence to discern the veritable essence of the great source of life. Here, for the first time, we apprehend a distant vision of what the Logos truly is and of the destiny he intends for us. And when the magnitude of this reality dawns upon our astonished consciousness, we are compelled to feel that, possessed of such knowledge, life can never again assume its former semblance. We cannot but marvel at the utter insufficiency of mundane conceptions of happiness, and indeed we cannot fail to perceive that the majority thereof are distorted, inverted, and devoid of potential for fulfillment, and that in his pursuit of happiness man has, for the most part, averted his gaze from the very objective he covets. Yet here, at last, resides truth and beauty surpassing all that any poet has envisioned, and in the illumination of this transcendent glory, every other joy is revealed as pallid, insubstantial, and unsatisfying. Certain of these aspects we must endeavor to elucidate in detail subsequently, but for the immediate juncture, the essential point is that this radiant perception, not merely of the absence of all iniquity and discord, but of the irresistible and universal presence of felicity, constitutes the initial and most potent impression experienced by one who enters the celestial world. Furthermore, this exalted sensation persists throughout the entirety of his sojourn therein, irrespective of the tasks he may undertake, and regardless of what further summits of spiritual sublimation may unfold before him as he advances into a fuller comprehension of the powers of this novel realm. The ineffable delight of existence in such a sphere forms the substratum of every experience, and the participation in the boundless joy of others is a perpetual companion to him. Nothing terrestrial can sustain a comparison with it. Nothing can adequately represent it. If one were able to conceive of the buoyant vitality of childhood transposed into spiritual existence and subsequently intensified 1,000-fold, even that image would remain but a faint adumbration of that which resides beyond all articulation, the vast spiritual vitality of this celestial realm. One manner in which this overwhelming vitality manifests itself is through the extraordinary rapidity of vibration inherent in all particles and atoms of this mental substance. Theoretically, we are cognizant that even here upon the physical plane, no particle of matter, however dense the form it constitutes, is ever in a state of quiescence. However, when through the awakening of astral vision, this becomes not merely a scientific hypothesis, but an immediate and ever-present reality, we begin to realize the universality of life, in a manner and degree hitherto impossible. The horizon of the intellect expands, and glimpses unfold before us of potentialities within nature that, to those remaining unseeing, must appear as the most extravagant of reveries. If such be the consequence of acquiring astral vision and applying it to the dense matter of the physical plane, contemplate the impact upon the mind of one who, having transcended this physical world and thoroughly analyzed the far more vivid life and swifter vibrations of the astral, discovers yet another and superior sense awakened within him, a faculty that unveils before his enraptured gaze a still loftier world. Therein the vibrations exceed in rapidity those of our physical plane to the same degree that the vibrations of light surpass those of sound. It is a world where the ceaselessly pulsating life surrounding and permeating him belongs to an order altogether superior, raised, as it were, to an immeasurably greater power. Chapter 3. Cognition and Instantaneous Communication in Heaven. The specific capacity by which the individual apprehends this environment is, in itself, one of the paramount phenomena of the celestial realm. He no longer perceives, hears, or feels via the distinct and circumscribed organs utilized on earth, nor does he have recourse to the significantly augmented vision and audition that were his possession on the astral plane. Rather, he unearths within his being a singular new potency that resembles none of the former, yet encompasses them all and transcends them significantly. Through this agency, he comprehends the instant any entity or object manifests before him, not merely through sight, sound, and sensation, but through an immediate cognition of its intrinsic and extrinsic nature, its antecedents, its consequences, and its potentialities, insofar as that plane and all beneath it are involved. For such a being to conceive is to actualize. There exists neither doubt nor vacillation nor latency in the direct operation of this elevated faculty. Should he contemplate a location, he is present there. Should he contemplate a confidant, that associate materializes before him. Misconstruction cannot occur, nor can superficial semblances beguile him, for every thought and sentiment of his associate lies exposed to his scrutiny as legibly as an inscribed page. If, among his cohorts, there exists one whose elevated faculty is similarly activated, their communion attains a completeness beyond terrestrial imagination. For such individuals there exists no distance or separation, no obfuscation of sentiment, and no imperfect articulation through inadequate verbiage. Interrogatives and responses are rendered superfluous, for thoughts are deciphered at the moment of their formation, and concepts are exchanged with a celerity equivalent to their genesis within the mind. All erudition lies accessible to their inquiry, provided it does not surpass the boundaries of this exalted plane. The history of the world is as perceptible as the present, for the indelible archives of nature's memory remain perpetually before them. History, whether ancient or contemporary, is unveiled at their volition, no longer subject to the fallacies or biases of chroniclers, for they may personally scrutinize any event that engages their interest with the absolute certainty of witnessing the truth in its totality. Should they possess the capacity to ascend to the superior strata of this plane, the extensive sequence of their prior incarnations unfurls before them like a scroll. They perceive the karmic antecedents that have shaped their current state. They ascertain what karma remains to be resolved before the final ledger is concluded, and thus they identify with infallible precision their exact station in evolution. Should the question be posed as to whether they can envision the future with the same clarity as the past, the response must be in the negative, for that capacity pertains to a yet loftier plane. Although prescience is attainable to a substantial degree in this realm, it is never absolute, for wherever the will of a developed individual penetrates the tapestry of destiny, he may introduce new filaments and modify the pattern of existence to come. The trajectory of the ordinary undeveloped individual, whose will is too impotent to bear significant weight, may frequently be prognosticated with lucidity, however. When the ego assumes firm command of his own future, precise precognition is rendered impossible. Chapter 4. Chromatic and auditory expressions of the mind. The initial impressions of the pupil who accesses the mental plane with complete consciousness shall most likely comprise a sense of overwhelming bliss, ineffable vitality, vastly augmented power, and the absolute confidence that emanates from such conditions. Upon utilizing his newly acquired faculties to survey his environment, he discovers himself submerged within what appears to be a veritable universe of perpetually shifting light, color, and sound, transcending anything his most exalted imagination had previously devised. Verily, it is asserted that eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither hath it entered into the heart of man to conceive the splendors of the heaven world. Furthermore, he who has once consciously experienced these wonders shall regard the terrestrial sphere forevermore with transformed vision. Nevertheless, this experience differs so radically from anything known upon the physical plane that in endeavoring to depict it, one encounters a profound sense of helplessness, not merely an incapacity to render it justice, an ambition which must be relinquished at the outset, but indeed an inability to convey even the slightest impression thereof to those who have not personally beheld it. Let an individual envision himself, possessed of the sensations of bliss and augmented power previously enumerated, suspended within an ocean of living light, encompassed by every manifestation of loveliness in color and form. Let him further conceive that these phenomena alter with each fluctuation of his ideation, constituting, as he subsequently ascertains, nothing other than the expression of his own thought within the matter of the plane and its elemental essence. For this substance is of the identical order as that which composes the mind-body itself. Consequently, when that vibration of particles which we designate as a thought transpires, it immediately propagates itself to the ambient mental matter, establishing corresponding vibrations therein, whilst mirroring itself with absolute fidelity within the elemental essence. Concrete thoughts naturally assume the semblance of their objects, whereas abstract ideas manifest through the most exquisite and flawless geometrical forms, although it must be borne in mind that numerous conceptions which remain mere abstractions to us become concrete realities upon this loftier plane. It follows that, within this elevated realm, any individual desiring to dedicate himself temporarily to tranquil meditation may indeed inhabit a world of his own creation, beyond all possibility of perturbation, possessing the additional advantage of perceiving his thoughts drift before him as a continuous panorama. If, however, he wishes instead to scrutinize the conditions of the plane wherein he is situated, it is requisite that he suspend his own ideation for the moment, lest its fabrications impact the sensitive matter surrounding him, and thereby modify the circumstances insofar as he is concerned. This cessation of thought must not be conflated with the mental vacuity sought in numerous practices of Hatha Yoga, wherein the mind is subjugated into passivity to admit external influences, a state bordering upon mediumship. Here the mind remains keenly active and alert, restraining its activity only sufficiently to preclude the intrusion of personal bias into the observation being conducted. When the visitor succeeds in this endeavor, he discovers that although he no longer radiates from himself the splendor of light, color, form, and sound so vainly described, these phenomena have not ceased to exist. On the contrary, their harmonies and coruscations appear grander and more replete than heretofore. In seeking an elucidation of this phenomenon, he realizes that this magnificence constitutes no arbitrary or meaningless display, nor a mere Devachanic aurora, but rather possesses a significance intelligible to him. He presently discerns that what he contemplates with such ecstasy is the resplendent color language of the Devas, the expression of their thought and communication, beings immeasurably superior to him in the scale of evolution. Through experimentation, he ascertains that he too may employ this novel and exquisite mode of expression. Through this discovery he enters into yet another portion of his inheritance within the celestial realm, the capacity to converse with and learn from its loftier, non-human inhabitants, of whom more shall be discoursed subsequently. It will by this juncture be evident why no distinct section could be allocated to the scenery of the mental plane, as was performed regarding the astral, for in truth, the mental world possesses no scenery save that which each individual himself engenders via his thought, unless one considers the countless beings who pass before him, who are themselves, in manifold instances, objects of transcendent beauty. Yet, it would be more precise to state that all potential scenery exists therein, that nothing conceivable of beauty in earth, sea, or sky is absent, but that each man perceives only so much as his own nature enables him to perceive, that to which his development during earth life and astral life renders him capable of responding. Chapter 5. Rhythmic Vibrations and the Cosmic Anthem. Should the observer wish to further his investigation of the plane and ascertain its nature when entirely uninfluenced by the cognition or discourse of its denizens, he may achieve this by ensconcing himself within an immense enclosure through which none of these extrinsic impressions may penetrate, subsequently scrutinizing the internal conditions. Provided this experiment is executed with meticulous solicitude, he discovers that the luminous ocean is not rendered quiescent, for its constituent particles persist in their vehement and rapid oscillation. Rather, it has become homogeneous, with the resplendent coruscations of color and interminable metamorphoses of form no longer manifesting. Instead, he discerns an entirely distinct sequence of rhythmic pulsations, which the more superficial phenomena had hitherto obscured. These pulsations are manifestly universal, and no barrier constructed by mortal agency possesses the capacity to impede or divert them. They engender no color and adopt no visible configuration, yet they flow with immutable constancy through the entire fabric of the plane, oscillating outward and inward like the respiration of some immense and concealed life. Multiple categories of these pulsations may be differentiated, divergent from one another in amplitude, in oscillatory frequency, and in the tonality of the harmony they transmit. Transcending them all undulates one colossal wave, the very heartbeat of the system, emanating from inscrutable loci upon far more elevated planes, infusing its vitality through our world, and subsequently receding in a majestic tide toward the source from which it originated. It approaches in one immense, undulating arc, its acoustic quality akin to the murmur of the ocean, and permeating it all reverberates a potent anthem of triumph, the very music of the spheres. The individual who has once perceived that sublime anthem of nature never entirely forfeits the memory. Even here, within this dismal corporeal realm of illusion, he detects it still as a resonant undertone, perpetually maintaining before his consciousness the fortitude, the magnificence, and the luminescence of the veritable existence beyond. Should the visitor possess immaculacy of heart and intellect, having attained a requisite degree of spiritual evolution, it is feasible for him to coalesce his consciousness with the motion of that majestic wave, to amalgamate himself within it, and to be transported upward toward its origin. While such a feat is indeed achievable, it is not prudent unless his master stands alongside him to recall him at the precise juncture from its potent embrace. Otherwise, its inexorable force shall sweep him away into superior planes, the transcendent glories of which his ego is not yet sufficiently fortified to withstand. He would forfeit sentience, possessing no assurance regarding the time, location, or manner of its restoration. It is undeniably true that the ultimate objective of human evolution is the realization of unity. Nevertheless, that consummation must be achieved in a state of absolute and perfect awareness, akin to a victorious monarch entering triumphantly into his inheritance, and not by drifting into assimilation within a state of vacuous insentience scarcely removed from total annihilation. Chapter 6. Dual divisions of the mental realm and the causal body. All that has been delineated heretofore relates exclusively to the lowest subdivision of the mental plane, for this sphere of existence, analogous to the astral and physical realms, is segmented into 7 distinct partitions. The 4 inferior strata are designated the planes of form, and these constitute the lower heaven world, wherein the average individual experiences a prolonged interval of felicity betwixt successive incarnations. The remaining 3 are styled formless, and they comprise the higher heaven world, the habitation of the reincarnating ego and the veritable domicile of the human soul. Such nomenclature is employed because, upon the planes of form, every thought adopts a definitive configuration, whereas upon the formless planes, intellection manifests in a wholly distinct modality. The disparity between these 2 divisions, the planes of form and those of formlessness, is salient and necessitates distinct vehicles of consciousness. The appropriate instrument for the lower heaven world is the mental body, whilst that for the higher heaven world is the causal body, the vessel of the reincarnating ego, through which he transits from life to life across the entire trajectory of evolution. A further significant divergence resides in the fact that upon the 4 lower planes, a degree of illusion remains possible. This applies not to the entity stationed therein with full consciousness during life, but rather to the unevolved soul, who enters subsequent to the transition designated as death. The elevated thoughts and aspirations which he engendered during earthly existence accumulate about him, coalescing into a protective enclosure, a subjective cosmos of his own making. Within this sphere he experiences his celestial existence, discerning but dimly, if at all, the veritable magnificences of the plane surrounding him, and frequently presuming that which he surveys to be the totality of existence. Nevertheless, it would be erroneous to deem this thought veil a constraint. Its function is to facilitate his responsiveness to specific vibrations rather than to preclude him from others. In actuality, these encompassing cognitions constitute the very agencies by which he draws upon the inexhaustible reservoirs of the heaven world. This mental plane itself mirrors the divine mind, an infinite repository from which each soul partaking of celestial beatitude derives sustenance commensurate with the vigor of the thoughts and aspirations nurtured during its physical and astral existence. Within the superior heaven world, such circumscription ceases. It is undeniable that even therein many egos remain but dimly and somnolently conscious of their milieu, yet, to the extent that they perceive, they discern with veracity. For thought no longer assumes the constrained configurations it sustained in the lower regions. Chapter 7. Observing the radiant dynamics of mental energy, while the precise psychological condition of the human residents dwelling within these variegated subplanes shall be accorded a more exhaustive treatment in its proper sequential section. A comprehension of the modus operandi of thought upon the lower and higher levels respectively is so indispensable to an accurate understanding of these primary divisions that it is deemed of significant value to chronicle certain experiments performed by our investigators for the purpose of elucidating this subject. At the inception of the inquiry, it became manifest that, analogous to the astral plane, the mental plane possessed an elemental essence distinct from the constituent matter of the plane itself, and furthermore, that this essence was characterized by a susceptibility to thought even more immediate than that observed in the lower realms. Within the heaven world, wherein all comprises thought substance, both the elemental essence and the plane's matter were subject to the direct influence of mental activity, thereby mandating a concerted effort to differentiate between these dual effects. Following several indeterminate trials, a methodology was adopted which afforded a reasonably lucid comprehension of the divergent results. This entailed one investigator remaining upon the lowest subdivision to project the thought forms, whilst his colleagues ascended to a superior level to observe from an elevated vantage, thus mitigating the hazard of confusion. Under these controlled conditions, the experiment of transmitting a thought of affection and benevolence to a remote friend was executed, yielding results of a remarkable nature. A species of vibrating shell materialized within the matter of the plane, radiating outward from the operator in all directions. This phenomenon bore resemblance to the concentric undulations generated in quiescent water when a stone is cast therein, with the distinction that this manifestation constituted a multidimensional sphere of vibration rather than a mere planar surface. These vibrations, akin to those upon the physical plane, albeit diminishing with greater graduality, attenuated in intensity as they propagated from the source, until, at vast distances, they appeared to evanesce or become imperceptibly faint. Every individual upon the mental plane functions as a center of radiant thought, with all emanated rays intersecting without mutual interference, analogous to the behavior of light. The expanding sphere of vibrations exhibited a multiplicity of opalescent hues, which gradually faded as the circumference extended outward. The impact upon the elemental essence of the plane was wholly distinct. In this medium, the thought instantly generated a defined anthropomorphic form of a singular color possessing various gradations. This entity immediately traversed the intervening expanse to the intended recipient, assimilated astral elemental essence, and thereby transformed into a typical artificial elemental of that plane, poised to discharge its beneficial influence. In assuming the astral vesture, the mental elemental surrendered a measure of its brilliance, although its luminous roseate hue remained discernible within the shell of coarser matter. This evidenced that the original thought animated the elemental essence of its native plane, and that the identical thought, combined with its configuration as a mental elemental, served as a soul for the astral elemental, thereby adhering to the paradigm wherein the ultimate spirit acquires successive sheaths during its descent through the planes and subplanes of matter. Supplementary experimentation corroborated that the color of the projected elemental correlated strictly with the character of the thought. Profound affection generated a glowing rose-colored entity, a concentrated aspiration for healing produced a silvery white elemental, and a resolute endeavor to stabilize and fortify a melancholic or despairing mind resulted in a luminous golden yellow messenger. In each instance, irrespective of the radiating colors and vibrations within the matter of the plane, a specific force, in the guise of an elemental, was dispatched toward the individual to whom the thought was addressed, this phenomenon occurring invariably, with but one notable exception. One of the operators, situated upon the lower division of the plane, directed a thought of intense devotion and reverence toward the adept who serves as his spiritual preceptor. It was immediately perceived by the observers stationed above that the consequence was, in a certain measure, a reversal of that which had transpired in the antecedent cases. It must be established as a premise that a pupil of any of the great adepts is perpetually linked to his master by a constant current of thought and influence, which manifests upon the mental plane as a magnificent ray or stream of dazzling light comprising all colors, violet, gold, and blue. Consequently, it might have been anticipated that the pupil's fervent, affectionate thought would transmit a specific vibration along this conduit. Instead of this, however, the result was a sudden intensification of the colors within this column of radiance, and a pronounced influx of spiritual influence toward the pupil. Thus, it is evident that when a disciple directs his thought toward his master, he serves in actuality to invigorate his connection with that master, thereby facilitating a channel for an additional outpouring of strength and succor to himself from superior planes. It would appear that the adept is, as it were, so replete with the influences which sustain and fortify that any thought which stimulates a channel of communication with him transmits no current toward him, as would ordinarily occur, but merely provides a broader aperture through which the vast ocean of his benevolence finds expression. Upon the arupa levels, the divergence in the effect of thought is exceedingly pronounced, particularly concerning the elemental essence. The disturbance engendered within the mere matter of the plane is similar, albeit significantly amplified within this far more refined substance. Yet, within the essence, no form whatsoever is created, and the modus operandi is entirely altered. Whereas in all experiments upon the lower planes it was ascertained that the elemental lingered in the vicinity of the person contemplated, awaiting a propitious opportunity to discharge its energy upon his mental, astral, or indeed physical vehicle, here the result is a species of fulguration of the essence, flashing directly from the causal body of the thinker to the causal body of the subject of his thought. Thus, while the thought upon those lower divisions is invariably directed toward the transient personality, here we influence the reincarnating ego, the true man himself. Should our message pertain to the personality, it shall reach that destination solely from above, through the instrumentality of his causal vehicle. Chapter 8. The geometry and hues of spontaneous ideation. It is inherent that the thoughts perceptible upon this plane are not all deliberately directed toward another individual, for many are projected to drift aimlessly, and the diversity of their forms and hues is virtually inexhaustible, rendering their study a distinct science and an exceptionally captivating one. A comprehensive exposition of even the principal classifications among them would exceed the space available within this volume. Notwithstanding, some comprehension of the principles upon which such categories may be established can be derived from an extract taken from a highly illuminating paper by Mistress Besant, published in Lucifer in September 1896. In that treatise, she postulates three fundamental principles governing the generation of thought forms produced by mental activity, namely, that the quality of a thought determines its color, the nature of a thought determines its form, and the definiteness of a thought determines the distinctness of its outline. To illustrate the manner in which color is influenced, she elucidates that when the astral and mental bodies vibrate under the dominion of devotion, the aura becomes saturated with blue, varying in intensity, beauty, and purity in accordance with the profundity and refinement of the sentiment. Within the precincts of a church, such thought forms may often be discerned ascending, generally not sharply delineated, but appearing as billowing masses of blue clouds. All too frequently, the hue is obscured by the intrusion of selfish emotions, wherein brown mingles with the blue and deprives it of its brilliance. Yet the devotional thought of a pure and selfless heart radiates a color as exquisite as the deep azure of a summer firmament. Amidst these blue clouds, golden stars frequently erupt, brilliant and resplendent, ascending precipitously like showers of sparks. Anger engenders shades of red, spanning the spectrum from brick red to vivid scarlet. Coarse anger manifests in dull, lurid flashes erupting from dark brown masses, while the anger of noble indignation appears as a bright scarlet, not devoid of beauty, though it transmits a disquieting vibration. Affection precipitates clouds of rose, varying in tone from dull crimson when the love is purely animalistic, to rose-red amalgamated with brown when tainted by selfishness, or with dull green when disfigured by jealousy. Yet it ascends into delicate and exquisite hues, resembling the first blush of dawn, as the love becomes purged of all selfish elements, and expands into ever-widening circles of impersonal tenderness and compassion for all who suffer. The intellect yields yellow thought forms, with pure reason directed towards spiritual objectives displaying a pale and beautiful yellow, whereas, when conjoined with selfishness or ambition, the color intensifies into rich shades of orange, clear and potent. One must bear in mind that the foregoing description encompasses both astral and mental thought forms, inasmuch as certain of the emotions cited necessitate matter from the lower plane, as well as the higher before they can manifest. Instances are also cited regarding the graceful flower-like and shell-like configurations sometimes adopted by nobler thoughts, and specific mention is made of the not infrequent circumstance in which a thought assuming human form may be misconstrued as an apparition. A thought form may adopt the semblance of its creator if that individual exercises a potent volition to be present at a specific location, to visit another person, and to be perceived. Such a thought form may replicate his own appearance, and a clairvoyant present at the locus would perceive what might readily be interpreted as his friend in the astral body. Should the thought contain a message, it might be conveyed in this manner, for the thought form could induce corresponding vibrations in the astral body of the recipient, and these, being relayed to the brain, would be translated into a definite idea or statement. Such a form might also relay impressions back to its projector through the magnetic link connecting them. The entire article from which these passages are derived merits careful study by those who desire to comprehend this intricate branch of the subject, for, aided by the exquisitely executed colored illustrations accompanying it, it enables even those without direct vision to approximate far more closely a true conception of the nature of thought forms than anything previously authored. Chapter 9. The Ethereal Ascension and the Veiling of Spirit. Should one inquire as to the precise distinctions characterizing the matter of the various subplanes within the mental plane, it proves arduous to formulate a response in anything other than the most generalized terms. Indeed, any endeavor to delineate the lowest plane so thoroughly depletes the author's lexicon of adjectives that virtually nothing remains for the superior levels. What more can be articulated, save that as one ascends, the substance becomes increasingly ethereal, the harmonies gain in richness, and the luminosity grows more vibrant and pellucid. Auditory vibrations acquire additional overtones, chromatic displays exhibit more exquisite gradations, and wholly novel hues, imperceptible to the physical eye, manifest. It has been observed, with equal measures of poetic grace and precision, that the radiance of the lower plane manifests as obscurity when viewed from the one immediately superior. Perhaps the concept may be rendered more lucid by commencing from the zenith rather than the nadir, positing that on the highest subplane one encounters matter vivified and energized by a force descending, akin to light, from a plane that transcends the mental realm entirely. Upon descending to the second subdivision, the substance of the first subplane functions as the energy of the present one, or, to speak with greater exactitude, the primordial energy, having amalgamated with the matter of the first subplane through which it has traversed, persists as the animating force of the matter within the second subplane. Within the third subdivision, the original energy is doubly shrouded within the matter of the first and second subplanes, such that upon reaching the seventh subdivision, The initial force is ensconced sixfold, and is consequently rendered more attenuated and less dynamic. This progression mirrors the veiling of Atma, the primordial spirit, during its descent as monadic essence to invigorate the matter of the cosmic planes. Inasmuch as this phenomenon recurs frequently in nature, students will find it advantageous to acquaint themselves thoroughly with the concept. Chapter 10. Chronicles of the World and Pathways of Service. In explicating the general characteristics of this plane, it is imperative to address the omnipresent backdrop composed of the archives of antiquity, the memory of nature, which constitutes the sole, truly veracious history of the world. Albeit that which resides upon this plane is not the absolute registry itself, but rather a reflection of a superior reality, it remains lucid, precise, and continuous, in stark contrast to the disjointed and spasmodic representations encountered within the astral sphere. It is only when a clairvoyant acquires vision of this mental plane that his retrospective perceptions may be deemed authoritative. Yet, even then, unless he can seamlessly transition from that realm to the physical with unbroken lucidity, one must allow for potential aberrations in the recollection of his observations. The student who has cultivated the dormant faculties necessary to employ the sensory perception associated with this mental plane, while still encased within the physical vessel, acquires entry to a domain of historical inquiry possessing transcendent allure. He may survey the totality of known history at his leisure, rectifying the errors and fallacies that have permeated traditional chronicles, and he may traverse the entire narrative of the world from its genesis, witnessing the incremental progression of human intellect, the descent of the lords of the flame, and the rising of the magnificent civilizations they instituted. His investigations are not confined solely to human advancement. He may scrutinize, as though within a gallery, the multifarious flora and fauna that populated the earth in its primordial epoch, trace the trajectory of momentous geological transmutations, and behold the cataclysmic upheavals that have periodically reconfigured the planet. The vistas unveiled by access to these archives are so vast and variegated that, were this the solitary benefit of the mental plane, it would nevertheless eclipse in interest all inferior realms. When one appends to this the prodigious augmentation of knowledge afforded by its faculties, the privilege of direct and unfettered communion with the Deva kingdom and the masters of wisdom, the respite from the weariness of physical existence, provided by its perpetual beatitude, and above all, the exponentially enhanced capacity of the cultivated student to serve others, one begins to comprehend the boons secured by a pupil who earns the prerogative to enter this resplendent domain of the heaven world at will and in plenary consciousness. In delineating the inhabitants of the mental plane, it is expedient to classify them into the identical three broad categories utilized for the astral plane: human, non-human, and artificial, albeit with naturally fewer subdivisions, inasmuch as the manifestations of human malevolence, which were prevalent upon the astral plane, find no habitation herein. Regarding the human inhabitants, as within the lower sphere, it is advantageous to distinguish between those still tethered to a corporeal form and those who are not, colloquially designated as the living and the dead, notwithstanding that this terminology is fallacious. Even a modest familiarity with the higher planes radically transforms a student's comprehension of mortality, for it becomes instantly self-evident, perceptible even in the astral and more acutely in the mental world, that the plenitude of true life cannot be realized within the physical, and that departure from this terrestrial sphere constitutes an entrance into veritable existence, rather than its termination. In the absence of exact nomenclature within the English tongue, it may prove least deceptive to refer to these states as embodied and disembodied. We shall now proceed to examine the inhabitants of the mental plane classified as embodied. Chapter 11. The radiance of masters and the exclusion of selfishness. Those mortal entities who, whilst still anchored to a corporeal form, navigate this plane with plenary consciousness and agency are, without exception, adepts or their initiated acolytes, for until a neophyte has received tutelage from his master regarding the employment of the mental vehicle, he possesses no liberty of action, even upon its inferior strata. To operate with awareness during terrestrial existence upon the superior levels denotes an even more exalted achievement, as it implies the unification of the individual. He ceases to be a mere personality, intermittently swayed by the individuality above, and becomes that individuality incarnate, albeit constrained by a physical vessel, yet commanding the potency and erudition of a highly evolved ego. to the vision disciplined to discern them, these adepts and initiates manifest as resplendent spheres of luminous radiance and hue, dissipating malevolence wherever they traverse, invigorating all within their ambit, much as solar rays nourish flora, and emanating an aura of tranquility and jubilation perceptible even to those lacking the faculty to behold them. Within this celestial sphere, a substantial portion of their most paramount labor is executed, particularly upon its loftier gradations, where they are enabled to operate directly upon the individuality. From this plane, they effuse the most sublime spiritual influences into the domain of thought, serving as the inspiration for grand and beneficent movements of every description. Herein, the spiritual potency generated by the sublime self-abnegation of the Nirmanakyas is disseminated. Furthermore, direct instruction is conveyed to advanced disciples, inasmuch as such tutelage may be imparted with far greater plenitude and efficacy here than upon the astral plane. Supplementary to these endeavors, they engage in significant operations regarding those designated as the deceased, although this topic shall be more appropriately elucidated hereafter. It is a source of gratification to note that a category of entities so conspicuous upon the astral plane is virtually non-existent within this realm. In a sphere defined by selflessness and spirituality, the black magician and his adherents discover no foothold, for selfishness resides at the very core of all practices within the darker schools, and their investigation of occult powers is prosecuted exclusively for personal aggrandizement. Albeit many among their number possess an acutely developed intellect, and by consequence a mental vehicle that is highly active and responsive along specific vectors. In every instance, those vectors are inextricably bound to selfish desire. Thus, they can manifest solely through the inferior portion of the mental body, which remains entangled with astral substance. As an inevitable corollary, their operations are virtually restricted to the astral and physical planes. It is true that a man whose existence is wholly inclined towards selfishness and malevolence may experience intervals of purely abstract cogitation, wherein he might employ the mental body provided he has acquired the requisite skill. However, the instant a personal motive intrudes and an endeavor is made to effect a deleterious result, the thought ceases to be abstract, and the individual finds himself once again operating through the medium of astral matter. One might almost assert that a practitioner of the dark arts can function upon the mental plane only whilst in a state of oblivion regarding his own nature. Even then, he is perceptible solely to those consciously active upon that plane, and never to those enjoying the celestial repose of this region following death, for each of the latter is wholly ensconced within his own world of thought, beyond the reach of external influence, and is therefore entirely secure. Thus is the ancient description of the celestial realm fulfilled, a sanctuary where the wicked cease from troubling and the weary find rest. Chapter 12. Glimpses of celestial bliss through sleep and trance. Upon contemplating the incarnate denizens of the mental plane, the inquiry naturally emerges as to whether common individuals during slumber or psychically advanced personages within a trance state might ever ascend to this elevation. In both instances, the response is in the affirmative. Nevertheless, such an occurrence remains exceptionally infrequent. Unblemished rectitude of life and intent is a prerequisite. Furthermore, even upon attaining this plane, one does not possess genuine cognizance, but rather merely the faculty to receive specific impressions. An episode associated with the investigations conducted by the London Lodge of the Theosophical Society regarding dream consciousness, certain aspects of which were delineated in my treatise on dreams, serves to exemplify this potentiality. During those endeavors, a mental projection of an exquisite equatorial vista was impressed upon the minds of various sleepers to ascertain the extent of their recollection upon awakening. One specific instance, hitherto unrecorded due to its lack of direct correlation with the dream phenomena then under scrutiny, proves particularly germane in this context. The subject was an individual of mental purity and substantial, albeit latent, psychic capability. When the conceptual image was impressed upon her, the resultant effect was extraordinary. The sensation of reverent beatitude was so acute, and the thoughts elicited so exalted and spiritual, that the sleeper's consciousness elevated entirely into the mental vehicle, ideest. It ascended to the mental plane. It must not be deduced, however, that she became cognizant of her environs on that stratum, or comprehended its inherent conditions. Her condition mirrored that of the average soul post-mortem who has achieved this level, suspended in an ocean of luminescence and hue, yet entirely engrossed in personal ideation, oblivious to all external stimuli, and resting in enraptured contemplation of the image and the concepts it had inspired. She perceived this phenomenon with the acute acuity, profounder appreciation, and potent cognitive vitality inherent to the mental plane, accompanied by its intense and immutable felicity. She persisted in this state for several hours, oblivious to temporal progression, and ultimately roused with a profound sense of tranquility and interior contentment for which she could offer no explanation, as she preserved no recollection of the events that had transpired. Notwithstanding the absence of memory, such an experience, whether recollected within the physical vessel or otherwise, must inevitably serve as a definitive catalyst for the spiritual evolution of the ego. Although additional investigations are requisite before formulating definitive deductions, it appears virtually assured that such a result could manifest only within an individual already possessing a degree of psychic development. This stipulation applies with even greater force in instances where a mesmerized subject might graze the mental plane whilst in a trance. Such is the rarity of this possibility that scarcely one clairvoyant in 1,000 achieves it whatsoever. Moreover, on the few occasions when it does transpire, the clairvoyant must possess extraordinary advancement and immaculate purity in both life and purpose. Even then, the challenge persists, invariably encountered by the uninitiated psychic, of interpreting a vision with precision from the higher to the lower plane. These considerations serve only to corroborate what has been so frequently emphasized: the imperative of rigorous instruction under a competent mentor, before substantial credence can be placed upon the assertions of psychics regarding that which they witness. Chapter 13. The evolutionary ascent of the reincarnating ego. Prior to engaging in a detailed scrutiny of the state of disembodied entities across the manifold subdivisions of the mental plane, it is imperative to apprehend with clarity the distinction subsisting between the rupa and arupa levels. Upon the rupa levels, the individual resides exclusively within a realm constructed of his own cogitations, remaining thoroughly identified with the personality recently relinquished. Conversely, upon the arupa levels, he exists as the reincarnating ego or soul, comprehending, at least in part, the evolutionary process in which he is involved and the labor he is destined to execute. It must be observed that every individual traverses both stages during the interim between decease and rebirth, although the unevolved majority exhibit such scant cognizance in either phase that they might be more precisely described as slumbering through them. Notwithstanding this, whether consciously or unconsciously, every human being is compelled to contact the superior levels of the mental plane before reincarnation may transpire, and as evolution proceeds, this contact becomes increasingly distinct and substantial. Not only does the individual become more sentient as he advances, but the duration of his sojourn in that realm of reality also extends, for his consciousness gradually ascends through the various planes of the system. Primitive man, by way of illustration, commands little perception beyond the physical plane during his earthly existence and the lower astral plane following death, a condition that pertains equally to the undeveloped individuals of our contemporary era. A marginally more advanced individual experiences a fleeting interval of heaven life, yet still passes the preponderance of the interlude between incarnations upon the astral plane. As progress ensues, the astral period diminishes, while the heavenly sojourn prolongs, until the intellectually and spiritually cultivated person traverses the astral plane almost unimpeded and savors a protracted and felicitous residence upon the more refined lower mental levels. By this juncture, however, the consciousness of the true ego upon its superior level is substantially aroused, thereby bifurcating his conscious existence on the mental plane into two segments, the latter and briefer portion, transpiring upon the higher subplanes within the causal body. This process reiterates itself, with existence upon the lower levels gradually waning, while the higher life waxes steadily more prolonged and replete, until that zenith is attained wherein consciousness becomes unified, the higher and lower selves inseparably fused, and the individual is no longer capable of restricting himself within the circumscribed nebula of personal thought or misapprehending it as the totality of the heaven world. At this stage, he perceives the true potentialities of existence and, for the first time, commences authentically to live. By the time such elevations are achieved, the individual will already have entered the path and undertaken full responsibility for his subsequent advancement. Chapter 14. The Law of Selflessness and Divine Justice. The superior reality of celestial life, in contradistinction to terrestrial existence, becomes manifest upon contemplation of the prerequisites essential for the attainment of this elevated state, the attributes one is obliged to nurture during incarnation to secure any manner of existence in the celestial realm post-mortem, are indistinguishable from those virtues which the most exalted members of humanity have invariably deemed intrinsically and enduringly desirable. In order for an aspiration or a force of cognition to materialize as sentient existence upon that plane, its preeminent characteristic must be selflessness. While attachment to kin or comrades may transport an individual into the celestial life, as may religious piety, it is erroneous to presume that every variety of affection or devotion inevitably finds articulation therein, for each of these attributes manifests in dual modalities, the selfish and the unselfish, and it may be rationally posited that solely the unselfish variant is authentically deserving of the appellation. There exists a form of love that bestows itself liberally upon its object, soliciting no recompense, oblivious to the self, and fixated exclusively upon that which it may contribute to the beloved. This sentiment engenders a spiritual potency capable of manifestation solely upon the mental plane. Conversely, there exists a passion occasionally designated as love, which is exacting and self-serving, primarily concerned with the receipt of affection, fixated upon acquisition rather than contribution, and prone to degenerate into jealousy at the most trivial provocation. Such attachment harbors no germ of mental evolution, and the energies it initiates never ascend beyond the astral plane. A similar principle applies to numerous religious devotees whose preoccupation lies not with the glorification of their deity, but rather with the salvation of their own spirits, thereby indicating that they have not yet evolved any faculty meriting the designation of a soul. Genuine religious devotion, however, is devoid of self-interest, replete with reverence and gratitude toward the deity or spiritual guide, and impelled by the aspiration to act on behalf of, or in the name of, the divine, frequently culminating in a prolonged and exalted celestial existence. This principle obtains irrespective of the specific deity or leader, such that adherents of Buddha, Krishna, Ormuzd, Allah, or Christ may all achieve celestial beatitude. The duration and quality thereof are determined by the intensity and purity of the sentiment, rather than its object, notwithstanding that the object may influence the opportunity for edification during that superior existence. The majority of human devotion, much like the majority of human love, is neither wholly unadulterated nor entirely self-seeking. Rare indeed is the affection strictly devoid of unselfish impulse, just as even a generally noble attachment may be occasionally obscured by jealousy or self-interest. In all such instances, the law of eternal justice operates with impeccable precision. A fleeting spark of noble sentiment within a less developed heart shall assuredly receive its recompense in the celestial realm, even should nothing else in that life elevate the soul above the astral plane. Conversely, the baser thought that once tarnished genuine love shall exhaust its momentum within the astral world, leaving unimpaired the magnificent celestial existence engendered by years of profound and enduring affection in this terrestrial sphere. Chapter 15. Initiating spiritual growth through acts of mercy. It is evident, therefore, that in the incipient stages of their development, many of the less advanced egos fail to consciously attain the heaven world entirely, whilst a substantially larger number experience merely a marginal engagement with certain of its inferior strata. Every soul must, of necessity, recede into its essential self upon the higher planes antecedent to reincarnation, however. This does not inevitably entail that, within such a state, the entity will perceive anything that might be properly designated as consciousness. Although this subject shall be elucidated more exhaustively when addressing the Arupa planes, it appears advisable to commence with the lowest of the Rupa levels and ascend progressively. For the immediate present, we may temporarily dismiss that segment of humanity whose conscious existence following dissolution is predominantly restricted to the astral plane, and instead contemplate an entity that has recently emerged from that condition, experiencing for the first time a transient and fleeting awareness within the lowest subdivision of the heaven world. Diverse methodologies may catalyze this critical phase in early soul development, however. For our current objectives, it suffices to exemplify one such method through a somewhat poignant narrative drawn from actual existence. as observed by our students during their empirical investigation of this phenomenon. In this specific instance, the instrument of the great evolutionary forces was an impoverished seamstress residing in one of the most desolate and squalid courts of London, a fetid thoroughfare in the East End, into which illumination and atmosphere could scarcely permeate. Naturally, she possessed negligible formal instruction, her existence having been an unremitting succession of the most arduous toil under extremely deleterious circumstances. Notwithstanding this, she was a benevolent and compassionate personage, replete with affection and solicitude for all whom she encountered. Her domicile was, perhaps, as modest as any within the court, yet it was maintained with an impeccable order and cleanliness surpassing the prevailing standard. She possessed no pecuniary resources to offer financial alleviation, when infirmity brought exigencies more dire than usual to certain of her neighbors. Nevertheless, she was invariably prepared to render whatever assistance lay within her power, allocating whatever moments she could spare from her labor to offer sympathetic ministration. She was, in truth, a veritable fountain of solace to the uncouth and untutored factory laborers surrounding her, who gradually came to perceive her as a celestial harbinger of succor and mercy, invariably present in times of adversity or sickness. Frequently, after toiling throughout the day with scarcely an intermission, she would maintain a vigil through half the night, tending to some of the numerous sufferers inevitably present in conditions so inimical to vitality and felicity as those of a London slum. Indeed, in many instances, the gratitude and affection her indefatigable benevolence evoked constituted the sole elevated sentiments they experienced throughout their harsh and sordid lives. Considering the prevailing conditions in that court, it is unsurprising that certain of her patients succumbed. Yet, it became manifest that she had achieved far more on their behalf than she realized, providing not merely ephemeral relief in mundane affliction, but also a pivotal impetus to their spiritual evolution. These were rudimentary souls, individuals of a retrograde classification, who had never yet initiated the spiritual forces requisite for conscious existence on the mental plane. Yet for the first time, not only had an aspirational ideal been presented, but truly altruistic love had been engendered within them through her agency. The very act of experiencing such a profound emotion elevated them, conferring augmented individuality, and upon the conclusion of their sojourn in the astral plane, they acquired their initial cognizance of the lowest subdivision of the heaven world. This preliminary experience was likely ephemeral and by no means sophisticated, yet it bore far greater significance than might be immediately apparent, for once the potent spiritual energy of selflessness is aroused, its manifestations in the heaven world possess a propensity to perpetuate themselves, and although this initial expression was slight, it imbued the soul with a subtle quality destined to re-emerge in subsequent lives. The tender beneficence of an impoverished seamstress thus initiated several less developed souls into conscious spiritual life, which shall grow steadily more potent through successive incarnations and increasingly influence their future terrestrial experiences. This episode perhaps elucidates why various theological systems place such pronounced emphasis upon the personal aspect of charity, the immediate communion between benefactor and beneficiary. Chapter 16. Celestial Reward for Unselfish Kinship Bonds. This initial subdivision of the celestial realm, whereto the exertions of the indigent seamstress elevated those she cherished, is principally distinguished by an affection for kin or associates, altruistic in essence, yet typically restricted in compass. It is imperative, however, to preclude any misinterpretation. When it is posited that familial attachment guides a soul to the seventh celestial subplane, while religious piety leads to the sixth, it is occasionally surmised that an individual harboring both attributes in substantial degree would partition his duration in the celestial sphere between the two strata, initially savoring extended felicity with his kin, and subsequently ascending to the succeeding tier to expend the spiritual potencies engendered by his devotional aspirations. Such is not the reality, for such an entity would awaken to consciousness within the sixth subdivision, wherein he would be engaged alongside those he held most dear in the supreme form of devotion he was capable of actualizing. This disposition is logical, for one capable of religious zeal as well as familial endearment naturally exhibits a superior and more expansive cultivation of the latter virtue than one whose sensibilities are confined to a singular trajectory. The identical principle obtains at all gradations. A superior plane invariably encompasses the attributes of inferior planes alongside those peculiar to itself, and its denizens generally display these characteristics in greater magnitude than souls residing upon lower levels. Consequently, when familial affection is delineated as the hallmark of the seventh subplane, one must not infer that love is circumscribed to that stratum, but rather that those who locate themselves there post-mortem are individuals in whom this mode of affection constituted the predominant quality, the very attribute that qualified them for celestial existence. Affection of a far loftier and more noble order, transcending anything extant upon this level, naturally subsists upon superior subplanes. One of the initial entities encountered by investigators upon this subplane furnishes a representative paradigm of its resident population. During his corporeal existence, he had been a modest grocer, not a figure of intellectual or notable religious advancement, but merely an upright and respectable tradesman. He likely attended ecclesiastical services with regularity due to convention, yet religion had remained a nebulous and inscrutable concept to him. Dissociated from his diurnal concerns and never swaying his determinations, he thus lacked the profundity of devotion that might have raised him to a superior subplane, notwithstanding he possessed a fervent and largely altruistic affection for his spouse and progeny. Perpetually present in his cogitations, they constituted the primary focus of his toils from dawn until dusk within his humble emporium. Consequently, following an interval upon the astral plane and emancipation from the disintegrating desire body, he discovered himself in the nethermost subdivision of the celestial realm, encompassed by all his beloveds. He remained no more intellectual or spiritually evolved than he had been during his terrestrial tenure, for death confers no immediate augmentation of such faculties. The environment wherein he was situated, alongside his family, mirrored only his highest mundane ideals of non-corporeal felicity, yet he experienced the utmost beatitude of which he was capable. By continuously contemplating his family rather than himself, he was cultivating selfless attributes which would become permanent constituents of his soul and manifest in subsequent earthly incarnations. Another illustrative instance was a gentleman who had deceased whilst his sole daughter was yet in her youth. In the celestial sphere she remained ever with him, invariably at her zenith, and he continually envisioned all manner of exquisite tableaus regarding her future. Yet another exemplar was a young maiden, who devoted herself entirely to contemplating the manifold virtues of her father and devising subtle surprises and novel gratifications for him. Another was a Grecian woman passing a marvelously felicitous time with her 3 offspring, one being a comely lad, whom she delighted in visualizing as the victor in the Olympic Games. A striking characteristic of this subplane for the preceding few centuries has been the profuse number of Romans, Carthaginians, and Englishmen to be located there. This originating from the circumstance that among men of these nations, the principal altruistic activity found its conduit through familial affection, whilst comparatively few Hindus and Buddhists reside here, since, in their instance, genuine religious sentiment typically enters more immediately into their daily existence, and consequently transports them to a superior stratum. There existed, naturally, an almost infinite variety among the cases observed, their disparate degrees of advancement being distinguishable by varying gradations of luminosity, while differences of color indicated respectively the qualities which the persons in question had developed. Some were lovers who had perished in the full vigor of their affection, and thus were perpetually occupied with the solitary individual they adored, to the absolute exclusion of all others. Others there were who had been virtually savages, one example being a Malay, a notably undeveloped man who obtained a slight experience of the celestial life in connection with a daughter whom he had cherished. In all these instances, it was the touch of unselfish affection which accorded them their paradise. Indeed, apart from that, there was naught in the activity of their personal lives which could have expressed itself upon that plane. In most instances observed on this level, the simulacra of the loved ones are far from perfect, and consequently the true egos or souls of the friends who are beloved can express themselves but poorly through them, although even at the nadir, that expression is much fuller and more gratifying than it ever was in physical existence. In terrestrial life we perceive our friends so partially we comprehend only those facets of them which are congenial to us, and the other aspects of their characters are practically non-existent to our perception. Our communion with them and our knowledge of them in this sphere signify much to us, and are often among the paramount elements of life, yet in reality this communion and this knowledge must always be exceedingly defective, for even in the very rare cases where we imagine we know a man thoroughly and entirely, body and soul, it is still only that portion of him which is in manifestation on these lower planes, while in incarnation that we can apprehend, and there resides far more behind in the true ego which we cannot access at all. Indeed, were it possible for us, with the direct and perfect vision of the mental plane, to perceive for the first time the totality of our friend when we encountered him post-mortem, the probability is that he would be quite unrecognizable. Certainly, he would not be at all the cherished one whom we thought we had known previously. It must be understood that the keen affection which alone draws one individual into the celestial life of another is a potent force upon these higher planes, a force which extends to the soul of the beloved and evokes a response therefrom. Naturally, the vividness of that response, the quantity of vitality and energy within it, is contingent upon the development of the soul of the loved one, but there exists no instance wherein the response is not a perfectly genuine one as far as it extends. Of course, the soul or ego can be fully reached only upon its own level, one of the Arupa subdivisions of this mental plane, but at least we are significantly nearer to that in any stage of the heaven world than we are in this realm, and therefore, under favorable conditions, we could there comprehend enormously more of our friend than would ever be possible here, while even under the most unfavorable of conditions, we are at any rate far closer to the reality there than we have ever been heretofore. Two factors must be taken into account in our consideration of this subject: the degree of development of each of the persons concerned. Should the individual residing in the celestial existence possess profound affection and a certain measure of spiritual cultivation, he shall construct a distinct and relatively flawless thought image of his acquaintance, as he perceived him. It is through this simulacrum that the soul of said friend may, upon that level, express himself to a substantial degree. However, to avail oneself fully of this opportunity, it is requisite that the soul in question be, in its own right, considerably advanced in its evolutionary progression. We perceive, therefore, that two distinct causes exist whereby such a manifestation might prove imperfect. Primarily, the image generated by the deceased may be so nebulous and ineffectual that the friend, notwithstanding his advanced evolution, may find himself unable to utilize it effectively. Conversely, even when a superior image is constructed, there may lack sufficient development on the part of the friend to enable him to derive appropriate benefit therefrom. Nevertheless, in every instance, the soul of the friend is reached by the emotive force of affection, and regardless of its developmental stage, it responds immediately by pouring its essence into the image thus created. The degree to which the true individual can articulate himself through this medium depends upon the two aforementioned factors: primarily, the quality of the image constructed, and secondarily, the magnitude of the soul available for expression. Yet, even the feeblest image capable of formation resides, at any rate, upon the mental plane, and is consequently far more accessible to the ego than a physical vessel situated two entire planes beneath. If the beloved friend remains among the living, he will naturally remain entirely oblivious upon this physical plane that his true self is enjoying this additional manifestation. However, this ignorance in no wise alters the fact that said manifestation is the more genuine reality, containing a closer approximation to his true self than this lower existence, which constitutes all that the majority of us can as yet perceive. A noteworthy consideration is that, since an individual may well enter into the celestial existence of several departed friends concurrently, he may thus be simultaneously manifesting himself in all these variegated forms, whilst perhaps also governing a physical body upon this earthly plane. This conception, however, presents no difficulty to one who comprehends the relationship between the differing planes. It is as facile for him to manifest within several of these celestial images simultaneously as it is for us to be consciously aware of the pressure of diverse articles against distinct parts of our physical form at the same moment. The relationship of one plane to another mirrors that of one dimension to another. Just as no aggregate of units in a lower dimension can ever equal one in the higher, so too can no quantity of these manifestations exhaust the responsive power of the ego above. On the contrary, such manifestations afford him a significant additional opportunity for development upon the mental plane, an opportunity which stands as the direct result and recompense, under the operation of the law of divine justice, for those actions or qualities which evoked such an outpouring of affection. It is evident from these premises that as man evolves, his opportunities in all directions expand proportionally. Not only is he more liable, as he advances, to attract the love and reverence of many, thereby possessing numerous potent thought images at his disposal upon the mental plane, but his power of manifestation through each of these, and his receptivity therein, also increase rapidly with his progress. This principle was aptly illustrated by a straightforward case which recently came under the observation of our investigators. It concerned a mother who had departed this life perhaps 20 years prior, leaving behind 2 sons to whom she was deeply attached. Naturally, they constituted the most prominent figures in her celestial realm, and quite naturally, she conceived of them as she had left them, as youths of 15 or 16 years. The love she thus ceaselessly poured upon these mental images acted, in truth, as a beneficent force showered upon the mature men in this physical world. Yet, it did not affect them both to an identical degree, not because her affection was more potent for one than for the other, but because a significant disparity existed in the vitality of the images themselves. This was not a difference, let it be understood, that the mother could perceive to her. Both appeared equally present and equally possessed of all qualities she could possibly desire. Yet, to the eyes of the investigators, it was patently evident that one of these images was far more imbued with vital force than the other. Upon tracing this compelling phenomenon to its source, it was ascertained that in the first instance, the son had matured into an ordinary man of commerce, not specifically malevolent in any regard, yet by no means spiritually inclined, whereas the other had become a man of high, unselfish aspiration, and of considerable refinement and culture. His life had been such as to cultivate a far greater volume of consciousness within the soul than that of his brother. Consequently, this higher self was able to vitalize much more fully that image of his youthful days which his mother had formed in her celestial existence. There existed a greater abundance of soul to infuse, and thus the image was vivid and animate. Further research revealed numerous similar instances, and it was clearly perceived that the more highly a soul is evolved in spirituality, the more fully it can express itself in such manifestations as the affection of its friends has provided. Through such fuller expression, the soul is also enabled to derive increasing benefit from the living force of that love as it pours itself upon him through these thought images. As the soul expands, these images become fuller expressions of its nature, until, upon attaining the level of a master, the individual consciously employs them as a means of aiding and instructing his pupils. Along these lines alone is conscious communication possible between those still imprisoned in the physical body and those who have transitioned into this celestial realm. As has been previously articulated, a soul may be shining gloriously through its image in a friend's celestial life, and yet, in its manifestation through the physical body on this plane, that soul may remain entirely unconscious of these events, and thus may suppose itself unable to communicate with its departed friend. However, if that soul has evolved its consciousness to the point of unification, and can therefore utilize its full powers whilst still within the physical body, it can then realize, even during this mundane earthly existence, that it still stands face to face with its friend as of yore. That death has not removed the man loved, but has merely opened his eyes to the grander, more expansive life which forever surrounds us all. In appearance, the friend would seem much as he did in his earthly life, yet somehow strangely glorified. Within the mind-body, as in the astral body, there exists a reproduction of the physical form contained within the outer ovoid, the shape of which is determined by that of the causal body, such that it bears somewhat the appearance of a form composed of denser mist, enveloped by a lighter mist. Throughout the celestial existence, the personality of the most recent physical life is distinctly preserved. It is only when the consciousness is finally withdrawn into the causal body that this sense of personality merges into the individuality, and the man, for the first time since this descent into incarnation, realizes himself as the true and comparatively permanent ego. Men sometimes inquire whether, upon this mental plane, there exists any consciousness of time, any alternation of night and day, or of sleeping and waking. The soul waking in the celestial world is the slow dawning of its wondrous bliss upon the mind sense as the individual enters upon his existence on that plane, and the only sleeping is the equally gradual sinking into blissful unconsciousness when the long duration of that life, at length, draws to a close. It was once described to us, at the outset, as a species of prolongation of all the happiest hours of a man's life, magnified 100-fold in bliss, and although that definition leaves much to be desired, it nevertheless approaches the truth far more closely than this concept of day and night. While there exists, indisputably, an apparent infinitude of diversity within the felicity of the celestial sphere, the cyclical alternations of slumber and wakefulness constitute no component of its fundamental design. Upon the ultimate severance of the mental vehicle from the astral counterpart, an interval of profound oblivion typically ensues. This period, fluctuating significantly in duration within expansive limits, is analogous to the state that customarily succeeds physical dissolution. The emergence from this suspension into operative intellectual awareness bears a striking similitude to the process frequently experienced when rousing from nocturnal slumber. Precisely as one, upon initially awakening at dawn, may occasionally traverse a phase of exquisitely pleasurable tranquility, during which one is cognizant of a sensation of gratification, notwithstanding that the intellect remains dormant and the corporeal form scarcely subject to volition. So too does the entity awakening into the heaven world first experience a distinct, variable period of profound and escalating beatitude prior to attaining full cognitive engagement upon that plane. When this sensation of transcendent rapture initially illuminates the entity, it saturates the entirety of his consciousness. Yet, as he achieves a state of complete wakefulness, he gradually perceives himself encompassed by a reality inhabited by his own ideals, and exhibiting those characteristics commensurate with the specific subplane to which he has gravitated. Chapter 17. Pure adoration and anthropomorphic piety. The preeminent characteristic of this subdivision may be delineated as anthropomorphic religious devotion. The differentiation between this mode of piety and the religious sentiment articulated upon the second astral subplane resides in the reality that the former is exclusively unselfish, whereas the latter is invariably swayed by the aspiration or yearning to secure some advantage. Consequently, upon the second astral subplane, any operative religious emotion inevitably comprises an element of self-serving expectation, whilst the devotion that exalts a soul to this sixth subplane of the heaven world is wholly liberated from such contamination. This phase of devotion, centered upon the perpetual adoration of a personal deity, must also be meticulously distinguished from superior forms expressed through the execution of specific deeds for the sake of the divinity. Several instances observed upon this subplane elucidate these distinctions with greater clarity than mere description could afford. Many entities whose mental activity manifests upon this level are derived from Oriental religions, yet only those exhibiting a pure, relatively unreasoning, and unintellectual devotion are encompassed herein. Worshippers of Vishnu, both in his avatar of Krishna and otherwise, as well as certain followers of Shiva, are discovered here, each absorbed within a self-generated cocoon of personal thought, solitary with their deity, and largely oblivious to humanity, save insofar as their affections link them to those they cherished upon earth. A Vaishnavite, for example, was entirely engrossed in the ecstatic worship of the identical image of Vishnu, to which he had tendered offerings during his terrestrial existence. Some of the most characteristic exemplars of this plane are women, who constitute a substantial majority of its inhabitants. Among them was a Hindu woman who had deified her husband, and envisioned the child Krishna playing alongside her own offspring. Whilst her children were genuine and human, Krishna appeared as the semblance of a blue wooden effigy brought to vitality. Krishna also manifested within her heaven as an effeminate young man playing a flute, yet she remained undisturbed by this dual representation. Another woman, devoted to Shiva, had conflated the god with her husband, perceiving the latter as a manifestation of the former, such that one appeared constantly to transmute into the other. Certain Buddhists inhabit this subdivision, apparently restricted to those less instructed individuals who regard the Buddha more as an object of adoration than as a preceptor. Christianity also contributes a multitude of inhabitants to this plane. Unintellectual devotion, exemplified by the illiterate Roman Catholic peasant and the earnest soldier of the Salvation Army, yields analogous results, for these individuals are absorbed in the contemplation of their conceptions of Christ or his mother. An Irish peasant, for instance, was discovered in profound adoration of the Virgin Mary, imagining her standing upon the moon, in the manner of Titian's Assumption, extending her hands and addressing him. a medieval monk, experienced the ecstatic contemplation of Christ crucified, his yearning love and pity proving so intense that, as he observed the blood flowing from Christ's wounds, the stigmata manifested upon his own mind-body. Another man, forgetting the crucifixion, envisioned Christ glorified upon his throne, with a crystal sea before him and a multitude of worshippers, amongst whom he and his family were positioned. His affection for his relatives was profound, yet his thoughts focused upon the adoration of Christ, whose form he imagined shifting kaleidoscopically between a man and the lamb bearing the flag, commonly depicted in ecclesiastical fenestration. A notable instance was that of a Spanish nun who perished at approximately 19 or 20 years of age. In her heaven, she returned to the era of Christ's life on earth, imagining herself accompanying him through gospel events and tending to the Virgin Mary subsequent to the crucifixion. Her depictions of Palestine were naturally inaccurate, presenting the Savior and his disciples in Spanish peasant attire, and the hills surrounding Jerusalem as mountains adorned with vineyards and olive trees draped with gray Spanish moss. She imagined her eventual martyrdom and repeated the experiences of this life in heaven, finding delight in reliving the sequence. A charming example of a child's heaven life concludes the illustrations drawn from this subplane. He had departed at the age of 7, and was occupied in reenacting within the heaven world the religious narratives which his Irish nurse had recounted to him upon the earth below. And best of all, he loved to conceive of himself as playing with the infant Jesus, and assisting him in fashioning those clay sparrows which the power of the Christ child is fabled to have animated and caused to take flight. It will be discerned that the blind, unreasoning devotion of which we have been discoursing does not at any time elevate its votaries to any great spiritual summits. Yet it must be remembered that in all instances they are entirely felicitous and fully satisfied, for what they receive is invariably the highest which they are capable of appreciating. Nor is it without a beneficial effect upon their future career, for although no quantity of mere devotion such as this will ever cultivate intellect, yet it does engender an increased capacity for a superior form of devotion, and in most instances it conduces also to purity of life. A person, therefore, who leads such an existence and enjoys such a heaven, as we have been describing, although he is unlikely to achieve rapid progress upon the path of spiritual development, is at least shielded from many perils, for it is highly improbable that in his subsequent birth he should descend into any of the grosser sins, or be lured away from his devotional aspirations into a mere worldly life of avarice, ambition, or dissipation. Nevertheless, a survey of this subplane distinctly emphasizes the necessity of adhering to St. Peter's counsel, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge. Since such curious results seem to ensue from crude forms of faith, one observes with interest to ascertain what effect is produced by the still cruder materialism, which, not long ago, was so painfully prevalent in Europe. Madame Blavatsky has stated in the Key to Theosophy that, in certain instances, a materialist possesses no conscious existence in the heaven world, since he did not, whilst on earth, believe in such a post-mortem condition. It appears probable, however, that our great founder was employing the term materialist in a much more restricted sense than that in which it is generally utilized, since, in the same volume, she also asserts that for them no conscious life after death is possible at all, whereas it is a matter of common knowledge amongst those whose nightly labors lie upon the astral plane that many of those whom we usually designate as materialists are to be encountered there, and are certainly not unconscious. For example, a prominent materialist intimately known to one of our members was recently discovered by his friend upon the highest subplane of the astral, where he had surrounded himself with his volumes and was continuing his studies almost as he might have done on earth. Upon being questioned by his friend, he readily admitted that the theories which he had maintained whilst upon earth were confuted by the irresistible logic of facts. However, his own agnostic tendencies remained sufficiently potent to render him unwilling to accept what his friend imparted to him regarding the existence of the still higher mental plane. Yet, there was certainly much in this man's character which could find its full fruition only upon that mental plane, and since his absolute disbelief in any life after death has not precluded his astral experiences, there appears no reason to suppose that it can impede the due working out of the higher forces within him in the heaven world hereafter. Assuredly, he has forfeited much by his disbelief. Doubtless, had he been capable of comprehending the beauty of the religious ideal, it would have evoked in him a mighty energy of devotion, the effect of which he would have been reaping presently. All that which might have been his is absent. However, his profound and altruistic familial affection, alongside his earnest and indefatigable philanthropic endeavors, constituted significant expenditures of energy. Such forces must inevitably engender a result, which can manifest nowhere save upon the mental plane. The privation of a singular mode of force does not preclude the operation of the remaining forces. A further instance, observed with greater recency, concerns a materialist who, upon awakening on the astral plane following his demise, presumed himself to retain his corporeal life, imagining his condition to be merely a disagreeable dream. Fortuitously for this individual, there existed within the cohort of those capable of functioning upon the astral plane the son of a former acquaintance, who had been commissioned to locate him and endeavor to render him assistance. Understandably, he initially perceived the young man as a mere figment of his slumber. However, upon receipt of a communication from his erstwhile friend referencing events that had transpired prior to the messenger's birth, he was convinced of the reality of the plane upon which he was situated, and immediately grew exceedingly avid to acquire all accessible intelligence regarding it. The instruction currently being imparted to him under these conditions will indubitably exert a profound influence upon him, substantially modifying not only the heaven life awaiting him but also his subsequent incarnation upon the earth. That which is elucidated by these two cases, and by a multitude of other examples, need not occasion astonishment, for it aligns precisely with what one might anticipate based upon experience within the physical plane. We consistently ascertain in this sphere that nature grants no concession for our ignorance of her laws. Should a man, laboring under the impression that fire does not sear, thrust his hand into a flame, he is swiftly convinced of his error. By the same token, a man's disbelief in a future existence does not influence the immutable facts of nature, and in certain instances, at least, he simply ascertained subsequent to death that he was mistaken. The specific variety of materialism alluded to by Madame Blavatsky in the aforementioned remarks was therefore presumably of a nature far coarser and more aggressive than conventional agnosticism, a disposition that would render it exceedingly improbable that a proponent thereof would possess any attributes necessitating a life upon the mental plane in which to reach their fruition. Chapter 18. Philanthropic Schemes and the Religion of Action. The paramount characteristic of this subdivision may be delineated as devotion articulated through active labor. The Christian upon this plane, for instance, does not limit himself to the mere adoration of his Savior, but rather envisions himself venturing into the world to render him service. This plane is uniquely adapted for the actualization of grand schemes and designs which remained unconsummated during the terrestrial existence, frequently encompassing vast organizations inspired by religious piety and generally directed toward philanthropic ends. It must be observed, however, that as one ascends to superior levels, greater complexity and diversity emerge. Thus, while a general characteristic may still be identified as dominant, variations and anomalies are increasingly liable to manifest. A distinguished instance, somewhat surpassing the average, was that of a gentleman occupied with the execution of a magnificent plan to ameliorate the condition of the lower classes. Being himself profoundly religious, he maintained the conviction that the initial measure in succoring the indigent was to enhance their physical well-being. The project, which he now prosecuted with success in his celestial life, utilizing meticulous care, had frequently presented itself to him on earth, although he had been rendered unable to implement it in that sphere. His design entailed the acquisition of one of the minor trades, perhaps comprised of merely 3 or 4 large firms, for the purpose of eliminating competitive advertising and other modes of commercial rivalry, thereby enabling him to sustain pricing structures while remitting significantly elevated wages to the workforce. An integral component of his scheme included the procurement of land and the erection of cottages for his employees, each accompanied by a modest garden, alongside the provision that each worker receive a share in the profits subsequent to a tenure of service, thus ensuring security for their senescence. Through this system, he endeavored to demonstrate the practical application of Christianity and to instill gratitude within the souls of his employees, thereby fostering their spiritual evolution. An analogous case involved an Indian prince whose terrestrial ideal had been the divine hero King Rama, whose existence and administrative methods he sought to emulate, while terrestrial circumstances had obstructed many of his efforts. In the celestial existence, all his undertakings achieved full fruition, guided by Rama himself, who proffered continual counsel and received perpetual adoration from devoted followers. A poignant example of personal religious exertion was that of a woman who had formerly been a nun of an active, rather than a contemplative, order. Her life had adhered to the principle, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." And in the celestial realm she continued to fulfill this mandate, dedicating herself to healing the infirm, feeding the famished, and assisting the impoverished, whereupon each individual she aided instantly assumed the semblance of Christ, whom she worshipped with fervent devotion. An instructive instance involved two sisters, both intensely religious, one a lifelong invalid and the other her attendant. On earth, they had frequently strategized their future religious and philanthropic endeavors, and in heaven each became the preeminent figure in the other's existence, the former now vigorous and healthy, with both collaborating to fulfill their unrealized terrestrial aspirations. This exemplifies the serene continuity of life for those possessing unselfish aims, wherein death removes suffering and facilitates labor that had previously been impossible. This plane also accommodates superior forms of devoted missionary activity. Commonplace, ignorant fanatics never attain this level, yet a few noble figures, such as Livingstone, might be found engaged in the congenial task of converting multitudes to their chosen faith. A particularly striking case observed was that of a devout Mohammedan who envisioned himself zealously laboring toward the conversion of the world and the establishment of governance in accordance with the principles of Islam. It appears that under certain conditions, artistic capacity may also convey its votaries to this subplane. However, a scrupulous distinction must be drawn here. The artist or musician whose sole objective is the egoistic pursuit of personal renown, or who habitually permits himself to be influenced by sentiments of professional jealousy, naturally generates no forces capable of elevating him to the mental plane whatsoever. Conversely, that most sublime category of art, whose disciples regard it as a potent power entrusted to them for the spiritual edification of their fellows, will manifest itself in regions even more elevated than this. Yet, between these two extremes, those devotees of art who pursue it for its own sake or regard it as an oblation to their deity, never contemplating its effect upon their fellows, may in certain instances discover their appropriate heaven upon this subplane. As an exemplar of this, one may cite a musician of a highly religious temperament who regarded all his labor of love simply as an offering to the Christ, and who knew nothing of the magnificent arrangement of sound and color which his soul-inspiring compositions were generating within the matter of the mental plane. Nor would all his enthusiasm prove wasted and fruitless, for without his knowledge it was imparting joy and assistance to many, and its consequences would assuredly be to grant him increased devotion and enhanced musical capacity in his subsequent incarnation. However, absent the still wider aspiration to aid humanity, this mode of celestial existence might reiterate itself almost indefinitely. Indeed, reviewing the three planes with which we have just been occupied, we may observe that they are in all cases concerned with the resolution of devotion to personalities, whether to one's family and associates, or to a personal deity, rather than the broader devotion to humanity for its own sake, which finds its expression on the subsequent subplane. Chapter 19. The Path of Wisdom and the Harmony of Great Masters. The activities of this, the supreme stratum of the Rupa levels, are so multifarious that assigning a singular attribute to the entire plane proves arduous. Perhaps they may be categorized into four primary divisions: the altruistic pursuit of spiritual erudition, elevated philosophical or scientific ideation, literary or artistic capability exercised for benevolent ends, and service rendered for its own inherent merit. The precise signification of each category becomes more lucid when specific instances are contemplated. The majority of the populace on this subplane is derived from faiths that accentuate the imperative of acquiring spiritual enlightenment, whereas on the sixth subplane numerous Buddhists, concentrated chiefly upon devotion to their leader as a personage. Here the more sagacious adherents aspire primarily to learn at his feet, perceiving him as a preceptor rather than solely an object of adoration. In their celestial existence, this aspiration is consummated. They are veritably receiving instruction from the Buddha, whose image is no vacuous form but a reflection of the wisdom, potency, and affection of that paramount earthly teacher. They are accumulating fresh knowledge and a broader comprehension, and although they may not retain specific minutiae, the impact upon their subsequent incarnation will be profound. instilling within the ego a propensity to adopt more comprehensive and philosophical perspectives. This instance clearly elucidates how such a heaven life precipitates the evolution of the ego and underscores the immense advantage garnered by those guided by living, potent instructors. A less advanced manifestation of this tuition occurs when a preeminent spiritual author has become a vital presence in the student's mental existence, constituting an ideal companion for contemplation. Such a figure may enter the pupil's celestial sphere, vivifying the mental image of himself and further illuminating the doctrines of his literary works. Many Hindus pursuing the path of wisdom attain their celestial abode upon this plane, provided their preceptors possessed authentic erudition. A few advanced Sufis and Parsis are also present, alongside certain early Gnostics whose spiritual maturation merited them extended residence in this ethereal region. Apart from this limited number, Mohammedanism and Christianity seldom elevate adherents to this stratum, although some devotees may attain it owing to the possession of attributes independent of their religion's specific dogmas. Earnest students of occultism, not yet sufficiently advanced to renounce celestial existence for the benefit of the world, are also discovered here. One such individual, a Buddhist monk personally known to investigators, had long harbored the hope of receiving instruction directly from adept teachers. In his heaven life, the Buddha stood as the central figure, accompanied by two masters closely associated with the Theosophical Society, expounding and illustrating his doctrines. These images embodied the plenary power and wisdom of the entities they represented, and the monk was receiving authentic instruction in occult subjects, likely advancing him onto the path of initiation in his subsequent incarnation. Another instance demonstrates the deleterious consequences of unfounded and uncharitable suspicion. A devoted, self-sacrificing student had, toward the conclusion of her life, developed an unjustifiable mistrust of her old friend and mentor, Madame Blavatsky. This disposition significantly circumscribed the higher influence and instruction she might have received in her celestial existence. The teachings were not withheld, yet her mental temperament rendered her partially unreceptive. She remained oblivious to this and believed she was experiencing complete communion with the masters. Nevertheless, investigators observed that her self-imposed limitation greatly diminished the benefits of her sojourn. An abundance of love, fortitude, and knowledge lay at her disposal, but her own ingratitude severely curtailed her capacity to assimilate it. It will be understood that since there exist other masters of wisdom beyond those connected with our own movement, and other schools of occultism operating along the same general lines as that to which we adhere, students attached to some of these are also frequently encountered upon this subplane. Transitioning now to the subsequent category, that of high philosophic and scientific thought, we discover here many of those nobler and more altruistic thinkers who seek insight and erudition solely for the purpose of enlightening and aiding their fellows. We do not classify as students of philosophy those individuals, whether in the Orient or the Occident, who dissipate their time in mere verbal disputation and semantic pedantry, for that is a mode of discourse rooted in egotism and vanity, and can therefore never contribute toward a genuine comprehension of the universal verities. For naturally, such inane superficiality yields no results capable of manifestation upon the mental plane. As an exemplar of a true student observed on this subplane, we may cite one of the later adherents of the Neoplatonic system, whose name has fortunately been preserved for us in the surviving archives of that epoch. He had striven throughout his terrestrial life to genuinely master the tenets of that school, and now his celestial existence was occupied in unraveling its mysteries and in endeavoring to comprehend its bearing upon human life and development. Another instance was that of an astronomer who appeared to have commenced life as an orthodox believer, but had gradually, under the influence of his inquiries, expanded into pantheism in his heaven life. He was still pursuing these studies with a mind replete with reverence, and was undoubtedly garnering real knowledge from those great orders of the Devas, through whom, on this plane, the majestic cyclic movement of the mighty stellar influences seems to express itself in ever-changing coruscations of all-penetrating living light. He was immersed in the contemplation of a vast panorama of whirling nebulae and gradually forming systems and worlds, and he appeared to be groping after some dim concept regarding the configuration of the universe, which he envisioned as some immense organism. His thoughts surrounded him as elemental forms shaped as stars, and one specific source of jubilation for him consisted in listening to the stately rhythm of the music that pealed forth in mighty chorales from the moving orbs. The third type of activity on this plane is that supreme genre of artistic and literary effort, which is chiefly inspired by a desire to elevate and spiritualize the race. Here we discover all our greatest musicians. On this subplane, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, Wagner, and others are still inundating the celestial realm with harmony far more glorious even than the grandest they were capable of producing whilst on earth. It appears as if a great stream of divine music poured into them from higher regions, and was, as it were, specialized by them and assimilated, to be subsequently sent forth through all the plane in a great tide of melody, which augments the bliss of all in the vicinity. Those functioning in full consciousness on the mental plane will clearly distinguish and thoroughly appreciate this magnificent effusion. Yet even the disembodied entities of this level, each of whom is ensconced within his own thought cloud, are also deeply affected by the elevating and ennobling influence of its resonant melody. The painter and the sculptor also, if they have pursued their respective arts always with a grand, altruistic aim, are here constantly fashioning and sending forth all manner of exquisite forms for the delight and encouragement of their fellow men, the forms being simply artificial elementals created by their thought. And not only may these beautiful conceptions afford deepest pleasure to those residing entirely on the mental plane, they may also in many instances be grasped by the minds of artists, still in the flesh, may act as inspirations to them, and thus be reproduced within the physical realm for the elevating and ennobling of that portion of humanity which is struggling amidst the turmoil of terrestrial life. A singularly poignant and exquisite figure observed upon this plane was that of a youth, formerly a chorister, whose terrestrial existence concluded at the tender age of 14. His entire soul was replete with melody and a youthful dedication to his art, profoundly tinctured by the conviction that through his song he articulated the spiritual yearnings of the multitude congregating within a vast cathedral, whilst simultaneously dispensing unto them celestial encouragement and inspiration. Although he had possessed scant knowledge beyond this solitary, magnificent gift of song, he had employed that faculty with nobility, endeavoring to serve as the voice of the populace reaching toward the heavens, and of the heavens reaching toward the populace, ever yearning to acquire greater musical understanding and to render it more worthily for the sake of the Church. Consequently, in this celestial existence, his aspiration was coming to fruition. Leaning over him was the quaint, angular figure of a medieval Saint Cecilia, manifest by his affectionate visualization derived from her depiction in a stained-glass window. Yet, although the external guise was thus a scarcely artistic representation of a dubious ecclesiastical legend, the reality residing behind it was vital and glorious, for the childish thought form was vivified by one of the potent archangels of the celestial hierarchy of song, through whose agency the chorister was instructed in a strain of music grander than any the earth has ever known. Here, too, resided one of earth's perceived failures, for the tragedy of terrestrial life occasionally leaves peculiar impressions even within the heavenly realms. In a world wherein all thoughts of beloved ones smile upon man as friends, this individual remained occupied with contemplation and composition in solitude. Upon earth, he had striven to compose a magnum opus, and for its sake had refused to debase his literary prowess, to secure mere sustenance through paltry hackwork. Yet as none would deign to consider his manuscript, he had wandered the streets in despair until sorrow and starvation finally closed his eyes to the terrestrial plane. He had endured loneliness throughout his existence. In his youth, he was friendless and excluded from familial bonds. In his manhood, he was capable of laboring only in his idiosyncratic manner, rejecting the hands that might have guided him toward a broader perspective of life's possibilities than the earthly paradise he yearned to construct for all. Now, as he engaged in thought and composition, although there were none whom he had loved as personal or ideal helpmates to participate in this, his mental existence, he perceived stretching before him the utopia of which he had dreamed and for which he had endeavored to live. He beheld the vast, thronging, impersonal multitudes whom he had longed to serve, and the ecstasy of their joy surged back upon him, transforming his solitude into a heaven. When he is reborn upon earth, he shall assuredly return with the power to execute as well as to devise, and this celestial vision shall be partially embodied within happier terrene lives. Many were discovered upon this plane who, during their terrestrial sojourn, had devoted themselves to the aid of mankind because they perceived the bond of brotherhood individuals who rendered service for the sake of service itself, rather than from a desire to propitiate any particular deity. They were engaged in elaborating, with full knowledge and tranquil wisdom, vast schemes of beneficence and magnificent designs for world improvement, whilst simultaneously maturing the faculties with which to implement them hereafter upon the lower plane of physical existence. Chapter 20. Reality beyond the shadows of earthly perception. Detractors who have inadequately grasped the Theosophical doctrine concerning the hereafter have occasionally contended that the existence of the average individual within the lower heaven world constitutes nothing more than a phantasm and an illusion, intimating that when one envisions felicity amidst kin and companions or triumph in the execution of designs, he is merely the prey of a merciless delusion. This concept is frequently juxtaposed, to its distinct disadvantage, against the purported substantial objectivity of the paradise pledged by orthodoxy. The rejoinder to such remonstrances is twofold. Firstly, in examining the enigmas of the future existence, our primary concern lies not with which hypothesis proves more agreeable, but rather with which is veracious. Secondly, a more rigorous scrutiny of the facts discloses that those who propagate the illusion theory approach the subject from a fundamentally erroneous standpoint and have misconstrued the actual conditions. Concerning the initial point, the true status quo is readily ascertainable by those who have cultivated the faculty to transition consciously onto the mental plane during physical incarnation, and such investigation entirely corroborates the accounts furnished by the Masters of Wisdom through Madame Blavatsky. This invalidates the hypothesis of solid objectivity and imposes the burden of proof upon orthodox critics. With respect to the second point, if it is posited that upon the inferior strata of the heaven world truth is not comprehensively apprehended, and that illusion consequently persists, this must be conceded, yet this is not the objection customarily implied. Critics frequently presuppose that celestial existence is more chimerical and less significant than physical life, a notion entirely antithetical to the facts. If it is intimated that one discerns but a fraction of the heaven plane because he fabricates his environment, the identical principle obtains on earth, where an individual perceives only that which his senses, intellect, and education permit. During physical incarnation, the average individual's comprehension of his environment is deficient and frequently fallacious, for he remains oblivious to the vast etheric, astral, and mental forces underlying all he observes, which comprise the most significant aspects of reality. Even the more recondite physical facts of daily existence generally transcend his comprehension. Thus, upon both earth and in heaven, man encounters a world predominantly of his own creation, unwittingly molded by his ignorance. If one asserts that in the heaven world a man regards his thoughts as substantial entities, this is correct. On the thought plane, thought alone is real, and these thoughts are capable of engendering profound and salutary effects upon living beings, inasmuch as only loving thought exists at that level. Therefore, the theory that heaven life is an illusion derives from a misconception and an inadequate cognition of its conditions and possibilities. The higher one ascends, the more proximately one approaches ultimate reality. To facilitate comprehension, one may regard the higher portion of life as a natural consequence of the antecedent experiences upon the two lower planes. Our loftiest ideals and aspirations are seldom realized on earth, which might appear to suggest futile exertion, yet the law of conservation of energy operates with equal efficacy on higher planes. Much of the spiritual energy generated by man cannot affect him during earthly existence, as the higher principles remain fettered by the physical body and unable to respond to subtler vibrations. In heaven, these impediments are eliminated, and accumulated energy manifests in the inexorable reaction demanded by the law of eternal justice. As Browning articulates, there shall never be one lost good. All that has been willed, hoped, or dreamed of good shall exist, not merely in semblance, but in reality, with each virtuous act enduring and consummating the imperfect arcs of earthly effort into a perfect circle in heaven. The high that proved too high, the heroic for earth too hard, the passion that left the ground to lose itself in the sky, are music sent up to God by the lover and the bard. Enough that he heard it once, we shall hear it by and by. Another point deserving of consideration is that this system, upon which nature has organized the life after death, constitutes the sole conceivable one capable of achieving its objective, rendering every individual happy to the fullest extent of his capacity for felicity. If celestial joy were of a singular modality only, as posited by orthodox theory, there must invariably be some who would tire of it, and others incapable of participating in it, either from a deficiency of inclination in that specific direction or from a lack of the requisite cultivation. This is to say nothing of that other patent fact, were this state of affairs eternal. The gravest inequity would be perpetrated by bestowing practically the identical reward upon all who enter, irrespective of their respective merits. Furthermore, what alternative dispensation regarding relatives and friends could possibly prove equally satisfactory? If the departed were capable of monitoring the vacillating vicissitudes of their companions on earth, felicity would be unattainable for them. Conversely, if, devoid of knowledge regarding their status, they were compelled to await the demise of those friends before reuniting with them, there would ensue an agonizing interval of suspense, often extending over many years, whereupon the friend would, in numerous instances, arrive so significantly altered as to be no longer congenial. Under the system so sagaciously provided for us by nature, every one of these difficulties is obviated. A man determines for himself both the duration and the character of his heaven life by the causes which he himself engenders during his earthly existence. Consequently, he cannot but receive exactly the measure he has merited, and exactly that quality of joy which is best adapted to his idiosyncrasies. Those whom he holds most dear he is perpetually alongside him, and invariably at their most exalted and superior state, while no spectre of dissonance or alteration can ever intervene between them, since he receives from them continuously exactly that which he desires. In actuality, the arrangement effectively established is immeasurably superior to anything which the human imagination has been able to proffer in its stead, as indeed we might have anticipated, for all those conjectures represented man's conception of what is best, whereas the truth constitutes God's conception. Chapter 21. The noble choice to forego celestial rest. It has long been acknowledged among students of occultism that as an individual advances with accelerated velocity, he may obtain the opportunity to abjure the so-called reward of Devachan, that is to say, to relinquish the existence of bliss in the celestial sphere intervening between incarnations, in order to return more expeditiously to labor upon the physical plane. The appellation of reward is not wholly precise, for a correct comprehension of the heaven life is more effectively attained by viewing it as the inevitable consequence of terrestrial existence rather than as its remuneration. During his corporeal life, an individual initiates, through his elevated ideations and aspirations, a specific quantum of spiritual momentum which rebounds upon him when he attains the mental plane. If minimal energy has been generated, it shall be rapidly dissipated, and the heaven life shall be transient. If a substantial quantity has been accumulated, a commensurate duration is requisite for its full manifestation, and the celestial experience shall be prolonged. As a man evolves spiritually, his sojourns within the heaven world extend in duration, yet this does not impede his advancement nor curtail his opportunities for utility. For all save the most supremely advanced individuals, the heaven life is indispensable, as only under its specific conditions can aspirations transmute into faculties, experiences into wisdom, and the soul achieve a progress far exceeding that which would be feasible through uninterrupted physical incarnation. Were the case otherwise, the law of nature would stand in paradox to itself, for the closer it approached its ultimate objective, the more it would appear to resist it. An interpretation incongruous with a law that incarnates paramount sagacity. The potentiality of renouncing the heaven life is not accessible to the general populace. The great law sanctions no one to abandon that which is unknown, nor to diverge from the standard trajectory of evolution until it is ascertained that such deviation shall result in ultimate advantage. In general, no one may abnegate the beatitude of heaven until he has experienced it during his tenure on earth, until he is sufficiently developed to elevate his consciousness to that plane and retain a lucid and integral recollection of a glory transcending terrestrial conception. This stipulation is equitable, for it suffices not for the ego merely to recognize the merit of sacrificing celestial bliss. The lower self must be fully cognizant of that which is being surrendered. The fruition of heavenly bliss upon the rupa levels pertains to the ego, but is manifested via the personality, and it is the existence of that personality, with all its accustomed environments, that is experienced in the lower heaven world. Consequently, antecedent to the possibility of renunciation, the personality must comprehend unequivocally what is being relinquished, and the lower mind must be in accord with the higher. Such comprehension presupposes a consciousness upon the mental plane during earthly life, equivalent to that which would be attained post-mortem. Consciousness evolves ascendingly from the inferior to the superior, and the majority of humanity remains effectively sentient only within the physical vessel. The astral bodies of the populace remain largely amorphous and disorganized, serving merely as conduits between the ego and the physical form, and as instruments for sensation, rather than as fully developed vehicles of superior faculties. Amongst more advanced lineages, the astral body is frequently better developed, and consciousness within it potentially more complete, though in the majority of instances the individual remains largely self-referential, aware primarily of his own ideations and scarcely of his environment. A select few assiduous students of occultism have been deliberately awakened upon the astral plane, thereby entering into the plenary utilization of their astral faculties and deriving substantial benefit thereof. This, however, does not connote that such individuals will immediately, or even for some duration, retain a complete memory of their astral experiences upon the physical plane. Generally, recollection is fragmentary and sporadic, and in certain instances, for diverse reasons, little or nothing of value from the higher existence penetrates into the physical cerebrum. Any manner of definitive consciousness upon the mental plane would, naturally, indicate still further advancement, and in the case of a man developing quite normally and regularly, one should anticipate finding such consciousness dawning only as the nexus between the astral and the physical became fairly well established. However, in this unilateral and synthetic condition, which we term modern civilization, individuals do not invariably develop with regularity and normality. Thus, there are cases to be found wherein a considerable degree of consciousness on the mental plane has been acquired and duly concatenated with the astral life, and yet no knowledge of this higher existence ever transpires to the physical brain whatsoever. Such cases are exceedingly rare, yet they manifestly exist, and in them we perceive immediately the possibility of an exception to our rule. A personality of this category might be sufficiently developed to sample the ineffable beatitude of heaven and thus acquire the prerogative to renounce it, whilst being able to transport the memory of it no further down than into his astral existence. However, since by the hypothesis that astral life would be one of plenary and perfect consciousness for the personality, such recollection would be amply sufficient to satisfy the requirements of justice, even though no vestige of all this ever penetrated the physical waking consciousness. The salient point to bear in mind is that since it is the personality that must resign, it is also the personality that must undergo the experience, and it must retrieve the recollection to some plane upon which it functions normally and in full consciousness, yet that plane need not be the physical if these conditions are fulfilled upon the astral. Such a case would be improbable to occur except amongst those who were already, at the very least, probationary pupils of one of the masters of wisdom. The individual who aspires to execute this formidable feat must, therefore, labor with the most intense earnestness to render himself a worthy instrument in the hands of those who aid the world. He must immerse himself with the most devoted fervor into labor for the spiritual amelioration of others, not arrogantly presuming that he is already suited for so distinguished an honor, but rather humbly anticipating that perhaps, after a life or two of strenuous exertion, his master may intimate to him that the time has arrived when, for him also, this may become a possibility. Chapter 22. The soul's return to the noumenal source. We now direct our attention from the four lower, or rupa, strata of the mental plane, wherein man functions through the agency of his transient personality, to the three superior, or arupa, levels, which constitute his veritable and comparatively enduring abode. Here, insofar as he possesses perception at all, his vision is unclouded, for he has transcended the illusions of personality and the refractive medium of the lower self. Thus, notwithstanding that his consciousness may be nebulous, oniric, and scarcely alert, his perception remains authentic, however circumscribed. The conditions of consciousness are so remote from those with which we are acquainted that all nomenclature utilized in psychology proves insufficient and deceptive. This realm has been designated the domain of the noumenal, as contradistinguished from the phenomenal, the formless as opposed to the formed, yet it persists as a sphere of manifestation, substantive in contrast to the unrealities of inferior states, and still possessing forms, albeit tenuous in material and subtle in essence. Following the period conventionally termed the heaven life, a distinct phase of existence attends the soul prior to its rebirth upon the earth. Although for the majority of individuals this stage is comparatively ephemeral, it must not be overlooked if a comprehensive understanding of man's superphysical existence is to be attained. Misconception arises because we habitually view existence fragmentarily, disregarding its intrinsic nature and purpose. Our perspective is predominantly that of the physical vessel rather than that of the soul, thereby engendering a distorted comprehension. Each movement of the ego toward the lower planes and its subsequent return constitutes a vast circular trajectory. We perceive merely a fragment of the lower arc as a linear progression, ascribing disproportionate significance to its commencement and conclusion, while the genuine turning point eludes observation. Contemplate this phenomenon from the vantage point of the true man upon his own plane as he attains a degree of consciousness. In response to the impulse for manifestation imposed upon him by the law of evolution, the will of the logos, he emulates that logos by projecting himself into the inferior planes. In so doing, he invests himself successively with mental, astral, and physical matter, progressively extending outward. During the initial phase of his existence upon the physical plane, the outward force is potent, however, approaching the meridian, it diminishes, and the inward trajectory commences. There is no abrupt alteration, the curve proceeds seamlessly, analogous to the aphelion of a planetary orbit. This signifies the authentic turning point of the cycle, although it frequently passes unobserved. In the Indian system, it was delineated as the conclusion of the grihastha, or householder period. From that juncture, the individual's force should consistently withdraw inward, with attention increasingly diverted from earthly concerns and oriented towards superior planes, thereby illustrating the incongruity of modern European life with genuine spiritual progress. The moment of physical dissolution is not of paramount significance in this arc. It is subordinate to the subsequent transition, the death upon the astral plane and the birth within the heaven world, which constitutes merely the transference of consciousness from astral to mental matter during the continuous inward withdrawal. The ultimate consummation of life is actualized only when consciousness is once again centered in the ego, within the higher heaven world, revealing the novel qualities acquired during that cycle. At this juncture, the soul undergoes an ephemeral illumination of lucid consciousness, discerning the results of the completed existence and some indication of their consequences in the subsequent incarnation. This glimpse does not impart minute knowledge of the ensuing life, but rather affords insight into the karmic ramifications of past actions. The soul avails itself of this opportunity in accordance with its stage of evolutionary development. Initially, the awareness is tenuous, as he is faintly conscious and inadequately prepared to comprehend facts and their interrelations. However, his capacity to perceive and subsequently retain such illuminations at the conclusion of successive lives develops progressively, enabling him to estimate the advancement achieved along the path of evolution he traverses. Chapter 23. The Resplendent Ovoid and the Awakening Soul. This constitutes the lowest of the formless subplanes and is simultaneously the most densely populated of all the regions known to us, for here reside nearly all the 60,000 million souls engaged in the current scheme of human evolution, excluding the relatively diminutive number capable of functioning upon the second and first subplanes. Each soul manifests as an ovoid form, initially appearing as nothing more than a tenuous film, colorless and scarcely perceptible, possessing the most exquisite and subtle texture. As the ego progresses, this body commences to radiate with a delicate iridescence, bearing a resemblance to a soap bubble, with colors undulating over its surface, like the shifting hues of sunlight upon the spray of a waterfall. Composed of matter so rarefied, delicate, and ethereal as to defy conceptualization, and vibrant with living fire, it gradually transforms into a resplendent sphere of oscillating colors, its rapid pulsations transmitting waves of mutable brilliance across its surface. Hues unknown on earth, luminous, tender, and magnificent beyond the capacity of verbal articulation. Envision the splendor of an Egyptian sunset, tempered by the subdued aesthetic of an English sky at twilight, then exalt these phenomena beyond their intrinsic nature in translucence and glory as far as they already surpass the pigments from a child's palette. Even then, no mind uninitiated can conceive the magnificence of these radiant orbs that burst into clairvoyant perception when it ascends to the level of this superior realm. All these causal forms are replete with a living flame descending from a loftier plane, with which the sphere appears connected by a quivering filament of intense brilliance, evoking the words of the stanzas of Dzian. The spark hangs from the flame by the finest thread of fohat. As the soul unfolds and becomes capable of receiving an ever-increasing measure from the boundless ocean of the divine spirit that pours down through this channel, the thread expands to admit a more substantial deluge until, on the subsequent subplane, it may be likened to a waterspout uniting earth and sky, and higher still to a vast radiant globe through which streams the inexhaustible current, until the causal form itself appears assimilated into the inflowing light. Once again the stanza speaks. The thread between the watcher and his shadow grows ever stronger and more radiant with each alteration. The morning light has evolved into meridian splendor. This is thy present cycle, asserted the flame to the spark. Thou art my very self, my image, my shadow. I have clothed myself in thee, and thou art my vehicle until the day of union, when thou shalt return into me, one with myself and others. Souls still connected to terrestrial bodies can be distinguished from those already liberated by the disparate vibrations that oscillate across the surface of their globes. Thus, it is a facile matter on this level to discern at a glance whether an individual is incarnate at the time. The vast preponderance, whether embodied or otherwise, remain in a dreamlike, semi-conscious state. Few now persist as mere achromatic films, and those fully awakened stand out as brilliant exceptions, shining among the dimmer multitudes like stars of the first magnitude. Between the most advanced and the least developed, one finds every gradation of size and chromatic beauty, each representative of the precise stage of progress the soul has attained. Most are still too nebulous, even within their limited awareness, to comprehend the purpose or the laws of the evolution they pursue. They seek rebirth through the impulse of the cosmic will and through tanha, the blind thirst for manifested existence, a craving for some state in which they may feel and know that they live. For in the incipient stages, these unformed souls are insensible to the rapid and penetrating vibrations of the highly refined matter of their own plane. Only the denser and more lethargic movements of physical matter can stir them, and thus they know life solely in the physical world, which elucidates their fervent desire for a return to earthly birth. For a duration, their longing aligns impeccably with the law of their growth. They can progress only by means of impressions from without, to which they gradually awaken to respond, and in this initial stage such impressions can reach them only during terrestrial existence. Incrementally, their responsiveness augments, awakening first to the finer forces of the physical plane, and still more slowly to the subtler influences of the astral. Subsequently, their astral bodies, which until now have functioned merely as bridges to convey sensations to the soul, gradually become definitive vehicles which they can utilize, and their consciousness begins to be centralized in their emotions, rather than in mere physical sensations. At a later stage, but always through the identical process of learning to respond to impacts from without, the souls learn to center their consciousness in the mental body, to live in and according to the mental images which they have formed for themselves, and thereby to govern their emotions via the intellect. Yet further along the arduous, extended trajectory, the center shifts to the causal body, and the souls realize their veritable existence. When that epoch arrives, they will be situated upon a higher subplane than this, and lower earthly existence will be rendered superfluous for them, however. For the present, we are contemplating the less evolved majority, who still project forth as groping, undulating tentacles into the ocean of existence. The personalities which are themselves on the lower planes of life, although they are as yet in no sense aware that these personalities constitute the means whereby they are to be nourished and to grow. They perceive nothing of their antecedents or their destiny, being not yet conscious on their own plane. Nevertheless, as they are slowly assimilating experience, there arises a perception that certain actions are beneficial and others detrimental, and this expresses itself imperfectly in the connected personality as the genesis of a conscience, a sense of right and wrong. Gradually, as they develop, this sense formulates itself with increasing lucidity in the lower nature, and becomes a less inefficient guide of conduct. By utilizing the opportunities provided by the flash of fuller consciousness, to which we have previously referred, the most advanced souls of this subplane develop to a point at which they are engaged in scrutinizing their past, delineating the causes initiated therein, and acquiring much from this retrospection, so that the impulses transmitted downwards become clearer and more definite, translating themselves in the lower consciousness as firm convictions and imperative intuitions. It is perhaps scarcely requisite to reiterate that the thought images of the Rupa levels are not transferred into the higher heaven world. All illusion is now past, and each soul perceives his genuine kindred, sees them, and is seen in his own regal nature, as the true immortal man who passes on from life to life, with all the ties intact that are knit to his real being. Chapter 24. The conscious ego directing the lower mind. From the densely populated region previously delineated, we traverse into a domain inhabited more sparsely, akin to the transition from a congested metropolis to a tranquil pastoral landscape, for at the current juncture of human evolution, merely a diminutive minority of souls has ascended to this elevated plane wherein even the least developed entity is wholly self-conscious and cognizant of his environment. Possessing the capacity to retrospectively survey his progressive history to some degree, the soul at this stratum apprehends the objective and methodology of evolution. He discerns that he is occupied with the labor of self-cultivation and identifies the phases of corporeal and post-mortem existence through which he has journeyed within his inferior vehicles. The personality to which he is bound is perceived as an integral extension of himself, and he endeavors to govern it, utilizing his cognizance of the past as a repository of experience. From this, he articulates lucid and immutable canons of conduct and convictions regarding rectitude and iniquity, which he impresses upon the lower mind, thereby supervising and orchestrating its actions. Although, during the nascent phase of his tenure on this subplane, he frequently fails to compel the lower mind to logically apprehend the foundations of these axioms, he succeeds in implanting the impression. Consequently, abstract concepts such as truth, justice, and honor become uncontested guiding tenets within the lower mental existence. Human regulations of conduct, enforced by social, national, and religious sanctions, may regulate behavior in mundane life, yet be subverted by abrupt temptation or overpowering passion. However, specific actions remain impossible for the evolved soul, for they are antithetical to his very essence. He is incapable of falsehood, betrayal, or the commission of ignoble deeds. These principles are ingrained within the innermost fibers of his being, and no vicissitude or torrent of temptation can coerce action in opposition to them, for they are intrinsic to the life of the soul. Notwithstanding, although he succeeds in directing his lower vehicle, his comprehension of it and its machinations is frequently imperfect. He perceives the inferior planes only obscurely, grasping their principles rather than their particulars, and a portion of his evolution herein entails entering ever more consciously into direct contact with the personality that so inadequately represents him below. It ensues that only souls deliberately aspiring toward spiritual maturation inhabit this plane, and they have accordingly become increasingly susceptible to influences emanating from superior realms. The channel of communication dilates, permitting a more copious influx of energy. Consequently, thought under this influence acquires an extraordinarily lucid and penetrating quality, even among the less developed, manifesting in the lower mind as a propensity toward philosophical and abstract contemplation. Among the more advanced, vision extends considerably, surveying the past with precise discernment, recognizing the causes set in motion, the realized effects, and that which remains unfulfilled. Souls upon this plane possess extensive opportunities for advancement when liberated from the corporeal form, receiving instruction from more evolved entities, and establishing direct contact with their preceptors. Communication is no longer conducted through thought images, but via a luminous radiance impossible to depict. The very quintessence of an idea passes like a star from one soul to another, its correlations expressed as undulations of light emanating from the central luminary, requiring no further explication. A thought functions akin to a lamp positioned within a chamber, illuminating everything in its vicinity without the necessity for verbal description. Chapter 25. The Supreme Zenith and the Glory of Mastership. This, the supreme stratum of the mental realm, remains occupied by but a scant minority of our species, for upon its pinnacles reside only the masters of wisdom and compassion alongside their consecrated disciples. Verbal articulation is insufficient to depict the aesthetic perfection of form, color, and sound that predominates here, for terrestrial speech possesses no terminology sufficiently capable of conveying such resplendent glories. It suffices to acknowledge their existence and to recognize that certain members of our lineage already bear these attributes, the harbinger of that which others shall achieve, the harvest of seeds disseminated upon lesser spheres. These individuals have consummated the trajectory of mental evolution, such that within them the superior aspect perpetually illuminates the inferior. From their vision, the veil of personality has been withdrawn, and they perceive with absolute conviction that they are not the lower nature, but merely utilize it as an instrument of experience. Among the less progressed of their number, it may yet exercise a degree of influence to inhibit or restrict, but never again can they conflate the vehicle with the self that resides behind it. They are safeguarded from this error by sustaining their consciousness uninterrupted, not merely from day to day but from incarnation to incarnation, such that past existences are not recalled as bygone history but remain perpetually present within their awareness, perceived as a singular continuum of life rather than as a multiplicity. At this elevation, the soul is cognizant of the lower heaven world as well as its own domain, and should it possess manifestations there, within the thought forms appearing in the celestial lives of associates, it may utilize them fully and with deliberate volition. Upon the third subplane, and even within the inferior reaches of the second, his awareness of the planes beneath him remained nebulous, and his agency through thought forms was predominantly instinctive and automatic. The moment he became firmly established upon the second subplane, his vision rapidly gained lucidity, and he identified those thought forms with jubilation as conduits through which he could express aspects of himself with greater freedom than through his personality. Now that he operates within the causal body amidst the blinding resplendence and magnificence of the celestial zenith, his consciousness becomes instantly and flawlessly operative at any locus of the lower divisions to which he directs his will. Thus, he may deliberately infuse additional vitality into a thought form whenever he elects to utilize it as an instrument of instruction. From this paramount stratum of the mental world emanate the majority of the influences dispensed by the masters of wisdom as they strive for the evolution of humanity, acting directly upon the human soul, bestowing the vitalizing energies that accelerate spiritual development, enlighten the intellect, and purify the emotions. Here lies the provenance of the illumination of genius. Here, all ascendant aspiration receives its direction. Just as solar rays radiate universally from a singular center and every body receiving them appropriates them according to its intrinsic nature, so from the elder brethren of the race precipitates upon all souls the light and life they are commissioned to dispense, and each entity absorbs the maximum quantity of which it is capable, thereby growing and advancing. Thus, as in all dominions, the paramount splendor of the celestial sphere is discovered in the glory of service, and those who have perfected their mental evolution become the wellsprings from which fortitude issues to those who remain in ascent, non-human. When we endeavor to delineate the non-human inhabitants of the mental plane, we are immediately encumbered by obstacles of the most insurmountable nature, for in attaining the seventh heaven, we confront for the first time a plane of cosmic magnitude, upon which may consequently be found numerous entities that human speech possesses no capacity to characterize. For the present purpose, it is prudent to disregard completely those immense legions of beings whose scope is cosmic, and to confine our exposition to those inhabitants indigenous to the mental plane of our own chain of worlds. It may be recollected that in the treatise regarding the astral plane an identical methodology was adopted, with no attempt made to describe visitors from other planets and systems, and although such transients are here far more frequent than in that lower realm, it appears most appropriate to adhere to the same protocol in this instance as well. A brief commentary, therefore, concerning the elemental essence of this plane and the divisions of the great Deva kingdom specifically related to it will be sufficient. Indeed, the extreme difficulty of presenting even these comparatively simple concepts will demonstrate definitively the impossibility of attempting to address others of far greater complexity. Chapter 26. The limits of language regarding cosmic entities. It serves to bring to remembrance that, in an antecedent communication from an adept preceptor, it was remarked that comprehending the constitution of the first and second elemental kingdoms transcends the capacity of any save an initiate, an assertion that underscores the circumscribed success likely to attend any endeavor to delineate them within this physical plane. It is prudent, initially, to endeavor to formulate as rigorous a conception as possible regarding the intrinsic nature of elemental essence, inasmuch as this is a subject upon which considerable perplexity frequently prevails, even amongst those who have dedicated extensive scholarship to theosophical treatises. Chapter 27. the divine effusion transforming into elemental life. Consequently, elemental essence serves merely as an appellation utilized during specific incipient phases of evolution to signify the monadic essence, a substance which may itself be characterized as the effusion of divine life, emanating from the second logos into matter. It is an established tenet that prior to this emanation attaining the stratum of individualization, wherein it forms the causal body of a human entity, it traverses and sequentially vivifies 6 inferior gradations of evolution, to wit, the animal, vegetable, mineral, and the 3 elemental kingdoms. Whilst functioning within these phases, it has occasionally been denominated the animal, vegetable, or mineral monad, a nomenclature that is patently fallacious, given that long antecedent to its ingress into any of these realms, it has already proliferated into a multitude of monads. Nevertheless, the terminology was utilized to intimate that, notwithstanding the commencement of differentiation within the monadic essence, the process had not yet progressed to the ultimate juncture of individualization, when this monadic essence functions within the 3 profound elemental kingdoms antecedent to the mineral. It is formally distinguished as elemental essence. Chapter 28. The multi-veiled descent of spirit into matter. Prior to apprehending the intrinsic nature of the monadic essence and the modalities of its manifestation across diverse planes, it is imperative to comprehend the mechanism by which spirit enshrouds itself during its immersion into materiality. The present discourse pertains not to the primordial genesis of the planar matter itself, but rather to the incidence of a fresh evolutionary undulation, penetrating substance that is already extant. Antecedent to the epoch currently under review, this vital surge has traversed incalculable eons, evolving through successive investitures of atoms, molecules, and cells in manners that largely transcend human cognition. For the immediate purpose, we shall bracket that anterior segment of its extensive history to concentrate exclusively upon its descent into the substance of planes more amenable to human intellect, albeit strata situated far above the purely physical level. It must be grasped that when spirit, residing upon any given plane during its downward trajectory into substance, is impelled by the inexorable force of its own evolution to advance to the inferior plane, it is constrained, in order to manifest therein, to clothe itself in at least the atomic matter of that lower stratum. Thus, it constructs a vehicle or veil of that substance through which it operates as the soul or animating principle. As it proceeds to a third plane, it must aggregate unto itself a portion of that realm's substance, thereby engendering an entity whose corporeal form is composed of the atomic matter of that third stratum. The force actuating this entity, its soul, is not the spirit in its pristine state upon the higher plane, but rather that spirit amalgamated with the veil of atomic matter acquired from the second plane through which it has transitioned. A subsequent descent to a fourth plane yields an entity of even greater intricacy, possessing a body of the fourth plane's substance animated by spirit that is already twice veiled in the atomic matter of the second and third planes. This process recurs for every plane of the solar system, such that by the time the primordial force arrives at the physical level, it is so profoundly obscured that it occasions little wonder that humanity frequently fails to recognize it as spirit. By way of illustration, a common, uninitiated clairvoyant attempting to scrutinize the mineral monad, the vital essence undergirding the mineral kingdom, would almost inevitably discern only the astral plane, and even that imperfectly, perceiving it merely as astral force. A more proficient scholar, observing with heightened faculty, would ascertain that what the clairvoyant perceived as astral force is, in truth, merely astral atomic matter invigorated by a force emanating from the atomic division of the mental plane. A yet more accomplished student would distinguish that this atomic mental matter serves solely as a vehicle for an essence derived from the highest Buddhic subplane, whereas an adept would perceive that the Buddhic substance is but a vessel for the nirvanic, and that the force, operating through all these successive veils, originates entirely beyond this cosmic prakritic plane, constituting a direct manifestation of the divine force. Chapter 29. The involutionary journey of mental essence. The elemental essence resident upon the mental plane comprises the first and second of the great elemental kingdoms. A surge of the divine life, having concluded its descending evolution through the Buddhic plane during an antecedent eon, precipitates into the seventh heaven to ensoul immense aggregations of atomic mental matter, thereby emerging as the elemental essence of the first great kingdom. In this primordial configuration, it does not amalgamate atoms into molecules to fabricate a corporeal vehicle. Conversely, it exerts a tremendous compressive force upon them via the mechanism of its own attraction. One may conceptualize this force, upon its initial advent at this plane during its descent, as wholly unhabituated to the prevailing vibrations and effectively incapable of immediate resonance with them. Throughout the aeon of its residence upon this level, its evolutionary process entails an acclimatization to oscillate at every conceivable frequency, to the end that it may, at any given instant, ensoul and employ any specific amalgamation of the matter inherent to that plane. During this protracted epoch of development, it interacts with every potential combination of matter across the three arupa levels. Nevertheless, upon the conclusion, it reverts to the atomic stratum, not in its original state, but rather bearing latent within itself all the faculties acquired. In the succeeding aeon, it descends into the fourth subplane of the mental realm, the zenith of the rupa levels, and fashions a vehicle from a portion of the matter characteristic of that subdivision. It thereupon constitutes the elemental essence of the second kingdom in its most rudimentary manifestation. Yet, as previously observed, throughout its evolution it adopts multifarious forms comprised of every possible combination of matter derived from the lower subplanes. It might reasonably be postulated that these elemental kingdoms, situated upon the mental plane, by virtue of their elevation, possess a greater evolutionary advancement than the third kingdom, which exists exclusively within the astral plane. Such a supposition, however, is erroneous. In this specific phase of evolution, the designation of higher signifies not superior advancement, but rather the converse, inasmuch as it concerns the monadic essence during its downward trajectory, and progress for elemental essence necessitates a descent into matter rather than, as is the case for humanity, an ascent toward more ethereal planes. Unless this fundamental principle is retained with absolute clarity, the scholar will continually confront perplexing anomalies and be precluded from achieving a comprehensive comprehension of this facet of evolution. The general characteristics of elemental essence were elaborated upon extensively in the treatise concerning the astral plane. Consequently, all propositions therein regarding the subdivisions of the kingdoms and their extraordinary receptivity to human thought possess equal validity when applied to these celestial varieties. Further elucidation is requisite regarding the configuration of the 7 horizontal subdivisions of each kingdom vis-à-vis the mental plane. Within the first kingdom, the paramount subdivision corresponds to the first subplane, whereas the second and third subplanes are each segmented into 3 distinct sections, each accommodating one of the elemental subdivisions. The second kingdom encompasses the lower heaven world, with its zenith subdivision corresponding to the 4th subplane, while the 5th, 6th, and 7th subplanes are each bifurcated to house the remaining subdivisions. Chapter 30. The power of radiant thought upon the elemental world. In the antecedent divisions of this treatise, substantial consideration was accorded to the influence of thought upon mental elemental essence. Thus it is superfluous to recapitulate that subject herein. Nevertheless, it is imperative to retain in memory that upon this plane, the essence is even more instantaneously responsive to thought than upon the astral plane, with the phenomenal susceptibility it displays toward the most minute mental activity being invariably noted by investigators. This attribute is rendered more intelligible when one comprehends that its very existence is contingent upon such responsiveness, and that its advancement is vastly expedited by the utilization made of it in the cogitations of those more evolved entities with whom it shares its evolution. Were it possible for it to be, for a transient moment, wholly exempt from the dominion of thought, it would manifest as an amorphous conglomeration of oscillating infinitesimal atoms, possessed, indeed, of a remarkable intensity of vitality, yet presumably achieving negligible advancement in its involutionary descent into matter. When thought engages it, however, animating the substance and sculpting it into exquisite configurations on the rupa levels and scintillating currents on the arupa levels, it receives a distinct, supplementary impetus which, upon repetition, accelerates its evolution. Whenever a thought descends from superior altitudes to address mundane concerns, it naturally assimilates matter from the inferior planes, bringing into contact with itself the elemental essence of which its primordial vestment was constructed. Thereby, it gradually habituates that essence to resonate with coarser vibrations, significantly aiding its downward evolution into matter. It is furthermore profoundly influenced by music, the resplendent deluges of harmony poured forth upon these exalted planes by masters of melody, who therein perpetuate the labors they had merely commenced upon this restricted terrestrial plane. A further salient consideration is the immense disparity between the grandeur and potency of thought upon this plane and the comparative feebleness of that which is designated as thought upon the earth. Conventional cerebration originates within the mental vehicle on the lower mental levels and invests itself in the appropriate astral elemental essence during its descent. Conversely, when an individual has sufficiently progressed such that consciousness operates within the true self in the superior heaven world, thought initiates there. It is first clothed in the elemental essence of the lower mental levels, rendering it infinitely more tenuous, penetrating, and profoundly effective. Should such thought be directed exclusively toward elevated objectives, its vibrations may prove too ethereal to manifest upon the astral plane whatsoever, yet when they do impinge upon lower matter, their impact is far more extensive than that of thoughts generated in closer proximity to the stratum of that substance. Extrapolating this concept further, the thought of the initiate arises on the Buddhic plane, transcending the mental world entirely and clothed in the elemental essence of the supreme heavens, while the thought of the adept descends from nirvana itself, wielding the stupendous and wholly inestimable potencies of regions situated beyond the grasp of ordinary human comprehension. Consequently, as our conceptualizations ascend, we discern ever-broadening horizons for the application of vastly augmented faculties, and we recognize the veracity of the maxim that the endeavors of a single day upon these levels may transcend in efficacy the toil of a millennium upon the physical plane. Chapter 31. Individualization and the heaven life of animals. Upon the mental plane, the animal kingdom is manifested through two principal divisions. Within the lower heaven world reside the group souls to which the vast preponderance of animals are affiliated, while situated upon the third subplane are the causal bodies of the relatively few members of the kingdom that have successfully undergone individualization. These latter entities are no longer strictly classified as animals. They constitute, for all practical intents, the sole existing exemplars of the most rudimentary causal body, undeveloped in magnitude, and merely subtly tinctured by the initial vibrations of newly emerging attributes. Subsequent to dissolution upon the physical and astral planes, the individualized animal typically sustains a protracted, albeit frequently dreamlike, residence within the lower heaven world. Its condition throughout this interim is analogous to that of a human being positioned upon the same level, though characterized by significantly diminished mental dynamism. The animal is encompassed by its own thought forms, even if it remains but vaguely cognizant of them, which inevitably incorporate the visages of its terrestrial companions in their most sympathetic and benevolent moods. Since the affection requisite to generate such imagery must also be of sufficient potency to reach the soul of the beloved and evoke a response, even those animals upon whom human kindness is bestowed may contribute, in some modest measure, to our own evolution. When the individualized animal withdraws into its causal body to anticipate the turning of the evolutionary wheel that shall afford it the opportunity for a primitive human incarnation, it appears to forfeit nearly all awareness of external phenomena, passing the interval in a state of delightful trance, distinguished by profound serenity and contentment. Even then, some manner of internal maturation is assuredly transpiring, notwithstanding that its nature remains arduous for us to fully apprehend. At the very least, it is indisputable that for every entity coming into contact with it, whether merely commencing human evolution or preparing to transcend it, the heaven world represents the zenith of bliss accessible at that entity's respective level of attainment. Chapter 32. The evolutionary path of the celestial angelic hosts. Scarcely anything can be articulated in mortal speech regarding these resplendent beings, and the preponderance of existing knowledge concerning them has previously been chronicled in the astral plane. For the edification of those lacking access to that treatise, I shall recapitulate here a fragment of the general elucidation provided therein regarding these entities. The supreme system of evolution, explicitly associated with this terrestrial sphere, insofar as can be ascertained, is that of the entities designated by the Hindus as the Devas, elsewhere identified as angels or sons of God. They may be regarded as constituting a kingdom situated immediately superior to humanity, precisely as humanity itself is positioned above the animal kingdom, albeit with this significant distinction. Whereas the animal can progress solely through the human stage, man, upon achieving the status of Theosophical or full adept, perceives before him diverse avenues of advancement, of which this magnificent Deva evolution represents but a solitary option. In Oriental literature, the nomenclature Deva is frequently utilized with ambiguity to signify virtually any category of non-human entity, encompassing the most exalted spiritual powers at one distinct pole and nature spirits, or artificial elementals, at the antipodes. In the present context, however, the term is restricted to the glorious evolutionary order currently under review. Notwithstanding their connection to the earth, these angels are not circumscribed by it, for to them the entire concatenation of 7 worlds is perceived as a singular sphere, their evolution extending throughout a vast system comprising 7 chains. Their cohorts have been augmented principally from other humanities within the solar system, some superior and others inferior to our own in advancement, inasmuch as merely a minuscule fraction of our own humanity has hitherto attained the specific gradation from which accession to their order is permissible. Nevertheless, it appears indisputable that certain of their multifarious classes have never, in their ascent, traversed a human condition comparable to our own. Much regarding their nature remains beyond our current faculties of comprehension, however. It is manifest that the objective of their evolution is incomparably loftier than our own. Whereas the purpose of human evolution is to exalt the successful portion of humanity to the station of the Aseka, adept by the conclusion of the 7th round, the objective of the Deva evolution is to elevate its vanguard to a vastly superior stratum within the corresponding duration. For them, as it is for us, there remains accessible a steeper, albeit more direct, trajectory toward summits of inconceivable sublimity. Yet, regarding the nature of those heights in their specific instance, we can engage only in surmise. Chapter 33. Hierarchies of light and the artificial thought forms. The 3 primary inferior categories, commencing from the lowest stratum, are habitually designated as Kamadevas, Rupadevas, and Arupadevas. These appellations may be interpreted as angels of the astral realm, the lower celestial sphere, and the superior celestial sphere. Precisely as the corporeal frame constitutes for us the lowest mode of embodiment, so too does the astral vessel serve as the customary vehicle for a Kamadeva. Consequently, he occupies a station analogous to that which humanity shall attain upon reaching planet F, for whilst residing habitually within an astral form, he possesses the capacity to ascend into more exalted spheres within a mental body, much as we might traverse in an astral form. And the transition into the causal vehicle would pose no greater tribulation to him than the assumption of the mental body presents to us. By similar token, the Rupa Deva employs the mental body as his standard medium, his habitation comprising the 4 Rupa strata of the mental plane, whereas the Arupa Deva pertains to the 3 superior tiers of that same plane, retaining no form of greater density than the causal. Transcending the Arupa Devas, there exist 4 yet more elevated orders of this kingdom, populating the superior planes of our solar system, and ascending further still. Positioned above and distinct from the Deva kingdom, reside the immense legions of planetary spirits. The examination of such sublime entities, however, falls outside the scope of our immediate objective. Each of the 2 partitions of this kingdom occupying the mental plane encompasses within itself multitudinous classes. Nevertheless, their existence is so removed from our own that only the most abstract impression may be communicated. Perchance the optimal indication of the impact produced upon the intellects of our investigators may be afforded by transcribing the precise verbiage utilized by one among them at the moment of inquiry. I perceive the effect of a consciousness of profound exaltation, a consciousness resplendent beyond all utterance, yet so singular, so entirely divergent from any human experience, that any endeavor to articulate it in language is utterly futile. Equally vain is any exertion upon the physical plane to communicate a concept of their visage, for it fluctuates in accordance with every trajectory of thought they pursue. Previous allusion has been made to the magnificence and expressive potency of their chromatic language, and it has further been observed, via transient remarks regarding human residence, that under specific conditions, men operating upon this plane may derive substantial edification from them. One instance was adduced of such a being vitalizing the angelic form within the celestial existence of a chorister, imparting to him harmonies superior to any ever audible on earth. And, in another case, Those associated with the governance of planetary influences were facilitating the progression of an astronomer. Their relationship to the nature spirits may be characterized as bearing some resemblance, albeit upon a loftier scale, to that of humanity vis-à-vis the animal kingdom, for just as the animal achieves individualization solely through association with man, so it appears that a permanent reincarnating individuality can generally be acquired by a nature spirit only through a comparable attachment to specific orders of devas. Nothing that has been, or can be articulated, regarding this potent angelic evolution does more than graze the periphery of a colossal subject, the more comprehensive cognition of which must be reserved for each student when he himself awakens the consciousness of the higher planes. Yet even these scanty and imperfect locutions may intimate some dim conception of the multitudes of auxiliaries with whom man shall come into contact as his evolution proceeds, and may indicate how every ascending aspiration, which his expanding faculties render feasible, is abundantly satiated by the beneficent provisions of nature. Artificial entities must likewise receive consideration. Scant discourse is required regarding this aspect, for the mental plane is yet more densely populated than the astral by artificial elementals, summoned into transient existence by the cognitions of its denizens. When one recalls that thought upon this plane is far more grandiose and potent, and that its forces are directed not merely by human inhabitants, whether incarnate or excarnate, but also by the devas and by visitors from superior planes, it will be apprehended that the significance and efficacy of such artificial creations can scarcely be exaggerated. It is superfluous here to reiterate that which has already been elucidated in the preceding manual regarding the effect of human thought and the necessity of guarding it scrupulously, for sufficient has been articulated in delineating the contrast between the action of thought upon the rupa and arupa levels to demonstrate how the artificial elemental of the mental plane is evoked, and to convey some sense of the infinite diversity of such ephemeral entities and the immense import of the undertakings accomplished through their agency. Adepts and their initiated neophytes utilize them extensively, and it is axiomatic that the artificial elemental engendered by intellects of such magnitude possesses a duration and a potency incomparably superior to those described in relation to the astral plane. Conclusion. Upon a retrospective survey of the foregoing exposition, the dominant sentiment is inevitably one of self-effacing acknowledgement regarding the absolute inadequacy of all descriptive endeavors and the futility of articulating, via mortal speech, the ineffable sublimity of the celestial sphere. Nevertheless, however deficient such a treatise must inherently prove, it remains vastly superior to silence, and it may impart to the peruser a tenuous apprehension of that which awaits beyond the grave. Upon attaining this luminous dominion of beatitude, the individual shall assuredly discover realities far surpassing previous anticipation. Yet, it is the fervent hope that he shall not be compelled to relinquish any of the comprehension he has garnered in this sphere. The human entity, in his present constitution, harbors inherent principles corresponding to two strata of existence superior to the mental plane. Specifically, his buddhi signifies his presence upon the level designated as the buddhic plane, while his atma corresponds to the third division of the solar system, customarily identified as the nirvanic. Within the average individual, these supreme principles persist in a state of virtual latency, and the dimensions to which they appertain reside even further beyond the grasp of descriptive delineation than does the mental realm. It is sufficient to posit that upon the buddhic plane, all circumscriptions commence their dissolution, and human consciousness undergoes such augmentation that the subject perceives, not merely as a theoretical abstraction, but as an absolute experiential reality, that the consciousness of his fellows is encompassed within his own. Consequently, he senses, comprehends, and endures with flawless sympathy all that resides within them, for it is in veracity an intrinsic component of himself. Upon the nirvanic plane he advances yet further, realizing that his consciousness and that of others are amalgamated in a superior sense, inasmuch as they constitute mere facets of the infinitely vast consciousness of the Logos, in whom all live, move, and possess their being. The dewdrop coalescing into the resplendent sea generates a phenomenon wherein the process appears inverted, as though the ocean were pouring into the drop, which for the first time recognizes that it is not simply a fragment of the ocean, but the totality thereof. A proposition paradoxical, wholly unfathomable, and ostensibly impossible, yet absolutely veracious. This much at least may be discerned. The beatific state of nirvana is not, as some erroneously conjecture, a condition of vacuity or negation, but rather one characterized by substantially greater and more beneficent dynamism. As we ascend the hierarchy of nature, our faculties are augmented. Our endeavors on behalf of others become ever more magnificent and extensive, and infinite wisdom and infinite power denote nothing less than an infinite capacity for service, for they are directed by infinite love.